Aristotle said, anyone could get angry, that's easy. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that's not so easy. Aristotle's words are in stark contrast with some items from this week's paper. 8 youngsters are wounded when an inadvertent bump in a crowd of teenagers milling outside a Manhattan rap club leads to a shoving match, which ends when one of those affronted starts shooting a .38 caliber automatic handgun into the crowd. The report notes that such shootings over seemingly minor slights, which are perceived as acts of disrespect, have become increasingly common around the country in recent years. For murder victims under 12, 57% of the murderers are their parents or step-parents. In almost half the cases, the parents say they were merely trying to discipline the child. The fatal beatings were prompted by infractions such as the child blocking the TV, crying, or soiling diapers. A German youth is on trial for murdering 5 Turkish women and girls in a fire he set while they slept. Part of a neo-Nazi group, he tells of failing to hold jobs, of drinking, of blaming his hard luck on foreigners. In a barely audible voice he pleads, "I can't stop being sorry for what we've done, and I'm infinitely ashamed." Each day's news comes to us rife with reports of the disintegration of civility and safety, an onslaught of mean-spirited impulse running amok. But the news simply reflects back to us on a larger scale a creeping sense of emotions out of control. No one is insulated from this erratic tide of outburst and regret. It reaches into all of our lives in one way or another. This audio tape is a guide to making sense of the senselessness. As a psychologist, and for the last decade as a journalist for the New York Times, I've been tracking the progress of our scientific understanding of the realm of the irrational. From that perch, I have been struck by 2 opposing trends, one portraying a growing calamity in our shared emotional life, the other offering some hopeful remedies. The last decade, despite its bad news, has also seen an unparalleled burst of scientific studies of emotion. Most dramatic are the glimpses of the brain at work, made possible by innovative methods such as new brain imaging technologies. Such findings offer a challenge to those who subscribe to a narrow view of intelligence and who argue that IQ is a genetic given that cannot be changed by life experience, and that our destiny in life is largely fixed by these aptitudes. That argument ignores the more challenging question, what can we change that will help our children fare better in life? What factors are at play, for example, when people of high IQ flounder and those of modest IQ do surprisingly well? I would argue that the difference quite often lies in the abilities called here emotional intelligence, which include self-control, zeal and persistence, the ability to motivate oneself, and empathy. And these skills, as we shall see, can be taught to children, giving them a better chance in life. Aristotle's challenge is to manage our emotional life with intelligence. Our passions, when well exercised, have wisdom. They guide our thinking, our values, our very survival. But they can easily go awry, and do so all too often. As Aristotle saw, the problem is not with emotionality, but with the appropriateness of emotion and its expression. The question is, how can we bring intelligence to our emotions, and civility to our streets, and caring to our communal life? Ponder the last moments of Gary and Mary Jane Chauncey, a couple completely devoted to their 11-year-old daughter Andrea, who was confined to a wheelchair by cerebral palsy. The Chauncey family were on an Amtrak train that crashed into a river after a barge hit and weakened a railroad bridge in Louisiana's Bayou country. Thinking first of their daughter, the couple tried their best to save Andrea as water rushed into the sinking train. Somehow they managed to push her through a window to rescuers. Then, as the car sank beneath the water, they perished. As an insight into the purpose and potency of emotions, this exemplary act of parental heroism testifies to the role of altruistic love and every other emotion we feel in human life. It suggests that our deepest feelings, our passions and longings, are essential guides, and that our species owes much of its existence to their power in human affairs. That power is extraordinary, Only a potent love, the urgency of saving a cherished child, could lead a parent to override the impulse for personal survival. Seen from the intellect, their self-sacrifice was arguably irrational. Seen from the heart, it was the only choice to make. A view of human nature that ignores the power of emotions is sadly short-sighted. As we all know from experience, when it comes to shaping our decisions and our actions, feeling counts every bit as much as thought. We've gone too far in emphasizing the value and import of the purely rational, of what IQ measures in human life. For better or worse, intelligence can come to nothing when the emotions hold sway. It was a tragedy of errors. 14-year-old Matilda Crabtree was just playing a practical joke on her father. She jumped out of a closet and yelled boo as her parents came home at 1 a.m. from visiting friends. But Bobby Crabtree and his wife thought Matilda was staying with other friends that night. Hearing noises as he entered the house, Crabtree reached for his .357 caliber pistol and went into Matilda's bedroom to investigate. When his daughter jumped from the closet, Crabtree shot her in the neck. Matilda died 12 hours later. One emotional legacy of evolution is the fear that mobilizes us to protect our family from danger. That impulse impelled Bobby Crabtree to get his gun and search his house for the intruder he thought was prowling there. Fear primed Crabtree to shoot before he could fully register what he was shooting at, even before he could recognize his daughter's voice. Automatic reactions of this sort have become etched in our nervous system, evolutionary biologists presume, because for a long and crucial period in human prehistory they made the difference between survival and death. For better or for worse, our appraisal of every personal encounter and our responses to it are shaped not just by our rational judgments or our personal history, but also by our distant ancestral past. This leaves us with sometimes tragic propensities, as witnessed the sad events at the Crabtree household. In short, we too often confront postmodern dilemmas with an emotional repertoire tailored to the urgencies of the Pleistocene age. That predicament is at the heart of my subject. One early spring day, I was driving along a highway over a mountain pass in Colorado when a snow flurry suddenly blotted out a car a few lengths ahead of me. Pressing my foot on the brake, I could feel anxiety flood my body and hear the thumping of my heart. The anxiety built to full fear. I pulled over to the side of the road, waiting for the flurry to pass. A half-hour later, the snow stopped, visibility returned, and I continued on my way, only to be stopped a few hundred yards down the road where an ambulance crew was helping a passenger in a car. The car had rear-ended a slower car in front. The collision blocked the highway. If I had continued driving in the blinding snow, I probably would have hit them. The caution that fear forced on me that day may have saved my life. I was overtaken by an internal state that compelled me to stop, pay attention, and take heed of a coming danger. All emotions are in essence impulses to act, the instant plans for handling life that evolution has instilled in us. In our emotional repertoire, each emotion plays a unique role. With anger, blood flows to the hands, making it easier to grasp a weapon or strike at a foe. Heart rate increases, and a rush of hormones, such as adrenaline, generates a pulse of energy strong enough for vigorous action. With fear, blood goes to the large skeletal muscles, such as in the legs, making it easier to flee. Among the main biological changes in happiness is increased activity in a brain center that inhibits negative feelings and fosters an increase in available energy, and a quieting of those that generate worrisome thought. Love, tender feelings, and sexual satisfaction are the physiological opposite of the fight-or-flight mobilization shared by fear and anger. The lifting of the eyebrows in surprise allows the taking in of a larger visual sweep and also permits more light to strike the retina. This offers more information about the unexpected event, making it easier to figure out exactly what's going on and concoct the best plan for action. Around the world, an expression of disgust looks the same and sends the identical message. Something is offensive in taste or smell, or metaphorically so. The facial expression of disgust, the upper lip curled to the side as the nose wrinkles slightly, suggests a primordial attempt to close the nostrils against a noxious odor or to spit out a poisonous food. A main function for sadness is to help adjust to a significant loss, such as the death of someone close or a major disappointment. Sadness brings a drop in energy and enthusiasm for life's activities, and as it deepens and approaches depression, slows the body's metabolism. This loss of energy may well have kept saddened and vulnerable early humans close to home, where they were safer. While in the ancient past a hair-trigger anger may have offered a crucial edge for survival, the availability of automatic weaponry to 13-year-olds has made it too often a disastrous reaction. A friend was telling me about her divorce, a painful separation. She was saying that her independence was appealing to her, that she was happy to be on her own. "I just don't think about him anymore. I really don't care," she said. But as she said it, her eyes momentarily welled up with tears. That moment of teary eyes could easily pass unnoted, but the watering eyes meant she's sad despite her words to the contrary. One is an act of the emotional mind, the other of the rational mind. In a very real sense, we have two minds, one that thinks and one that feels. These two fundamentally different ways of knowing interact to construct our mental life. One, the rational mind, is the mode of comprehension we are typically conscious of, more prominent in awareness, thoughtful, able to ponder and reflect. But alongside that, there's another system of knowing, impulsive and powerful, if sometimes illogical, the emotional mind. The emotional-rational dichotomy approximates the folk distinction between heart and head. Knowing something is right in your heart is a different order of conviction, somehow a deeper kind of certainty, than thinking so with your rational mind. These two minds, the emotional and the rational, operate in tight harmony for the most part, intertwining their very different ways of knowing to guide us through the world. In many or most moments, these two minds are exquisitely coordinated. Feelings are essential to thought, thought to feeling. But when passions surge, the balance tips. It's the emotional mind that captures the upper hand, swamping the rational mind. To better grasp the potent hold of the emotions on the thinking mind, and why feeling and reason are so readily at war, consider how the brain evolved. Human brains are about triple the size of those in our nearest cousins in evolution, the non-human primates. Over millions of years of evolution, the brain has grown from the bottom up, with its higher centers developing as elaborations of lower, more ancient parts. The most primitive part of the brain, shared with all species that have more than a minimal nervous system, is the brainstem surrounding the top of the spinal cord. This root brain regulates basic life functions like breathing and the metabolism of the body's other organs. This primitive brain can't be said to think or learn. Rather, it's a set of pre-programmed regulators that keep the body running as it should and reacting in a way that ensures survival. From the most primitive root, the brainstem, emerged the emotional centers. Millions of years later in evolution, from these emotional areas evolved the thinking brain, or neocortex, the great bulb of convoluted tissues that make up the brain's top layers. The fact that the thinking brain grew from the emotional reveals much about the relationship of thought to feeling. There was an emotional brain long before there was a rational one. This new addition to the brain allowed the addition of nuance to emotional life. Take love. Limbic structures, the part of the brain that rings and borders the brainstem, generate feelings of pleasure and sexual desire, the emotions that feed sexual passion. But the addition of the neocortex and its connections to the limbic system allowed for the mother-child bond that's the basis of the family unit and the long-term commitment to child-rearing that makes human development possible. Species that have no neocortex, like reptiles, lack maternal affection. When their young hatch, the newborns have to hide to avoid being cannibalized. On a hot August day in 1963, Richard Robles, a seasoned burglar, broke into an apartment that belonged to two young women, Janice Wiley, a researcher at Newsweek magazine, and Emily Hoffert, a grade school teacher. Though Robles thought no one would be there, Wiley was home. Threatening her with a knife, Robles tied her up. As he was leaving, Hoffert came home. To make good his escape, Robles began to tie her up too. As Robles tells the tale years later, Janice Wiley warned him she would remember his face and help the police track him down. Robles panicked at that, completely losing control. In a frenzy, he grabbed a soda bottle and clubbed the women until they were unconscious. Then, awash in rage and fear, he slashed and stabbed them over and over with the kitchen knife. Looking back on that moment some 25 years later, Robles laments, "I just went bananas. My head just exploded." Such emotional explosions are neural hijackings. At those moments, evidence suggests, a center in the limbic brain proclaims an emergency, recruiting the rest of the brain to its urgent agenda. The hijacking occurs in an instant, triggering this reaction crucial moments before the neocortex, the thinking brain, has had a chance to glimpse fully what's happening, let alone decide if it's a good idea. The hallmark of such a hijack is that once the moment passes, those so possessed have the sense of not knowing what came over them. These hijacks happen to us with fair frequency. Think back to the last time you lost it, blowing up at someone, your spouse or child, or perhaps the driver of another car, to a degree that later, with some reflection and hindsight, seemed uncalled for. In all probability, that, too, was such a hijacking, a neural takeover which, as we shall see, originates in the amygdala, a center in the limbic brain. The hippocampus and the amygdala are two key parts of the primitive nose brain that in evolution gave rise to the cortex and then the neocortex. To this day, these limbic structures do much or most of the brain's learning and remembering. The amygdala is the specialist for emotional matters. If the amygdala is severed from the rest of the brain, the result is a striking inability to gauge the emotional meaning of events. The amygdala acts as a storehouse of emotional memory and thus of significance itself. Life without the amygdala is a life stripped of personal meanings. More than affection is tied to the amygdala, all passion depends on it. Animals that have their amygdala removed lack fear and rage. They lose the urge to compete or cooperate. They no longer have any sense of their place in their kind's social order. Emotion is blunted or absent. Joseph Ledoux, a neuroscientist at the Center for Neuroscience at New York University, was the first to discover the key role of the amygdala in the emotional brain. Ledoux's research explains how the amygdala can take control over what we do, even as the thinking brain, the neocortex, is still coming to a decision. In the brain's architecture, the amygdala is poised something like an alarm company where operators stand ready to send out emergency calls to the fire department, the police, or a neighbor whenever a home security system signals trouble. When it sounds an alarm of, say, fear, it sends urgent messages to every major part of the brain. It triggers the secretion of the body's fight-or-flight hormones, mobilizes the centers for movement, and activates the cardiovascular system, the muscles, and the gut. A friend tells of having been on vacation in England, taking a stroll along a canal. He suddenly saw a girl gazing at the water, her face frozen in fear. Before he knew quite why, he had jumped in the water. Only once he was in the water did he realize that the girl was staring in shock at a toddler who had fallen in, whom he was able to rescue. What made him jump in the water before he knew why? The answer, very likely, was his amygdala. Ledoux's research is revolutionary for understanding emotional life because it's the first to work out neural pathways for feelings that bypass the neocortex. Those feelings that take the direct route through the amygdala include our most primitive and potent. This circuit does much to explain the power of emotion to overwhelm rationality. While the hippocampus remembers the dry facts, the amygdala retains the emotional flavor that goes with those facts. As Ledoux put it to me, the hippocampus is crucial in recognizing a face as that of your cousin, but it's the amygdala that adds, "You don't really like her." Ledoux turns to the role of the amygdala in childhood to support what has long been a basic tenet of psychoanalytic thought, that the interactions of life's earliest years lay down a set of emotional lessons based on the attunement and upsets in the contacts between infant and caretakers. These emotional lessons are so potent, believes Ledoux, that they're stored in the amygdala as rough, wordless blueprints for emotional life. One reason we can be so baffled by our emotional outbursts, then, is that they often date from a time early in our lives when things were bewildering and we didn't yet have words for comprehending events. We may have the chaotic feelings, but not the words for the memories that form them. As Ledoux points out, you don't need to know exactly what something is to know that it might be dangerous. If the amygdala senses a sensory pattern of import emerging, it jumps to a conclusion, triggering its reactions before there's full confirming evidence or any confirmation at all. The brain's damper switch for the amygdala's surges appears to lie in the prefrontal lobes, just behind the forehead. The prefrontal cortex seems to be at work when someone is fearful or enraged, but stifles or controls the feeling in order to deal more effectively with the situation at hand. This neocortical area of the brain brings a more analytic or appropriate response to our emotional impulse, modulated in the amygdala and other limbic areas. The neocortical response is slower in brain time than the hijack mechanism because it involves more circuitry. The connections between the amygdala and the neocortex are the hub of the battles or cooperative treaties struck between head and heart, thought and feeling. This circuitry explains why emotion is so crucial to effective thought, both in making wise decisions and in simply allowing us to think clearly. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for working memory, but signals of strong emotions, anxiety, anger, and the like can create neural static, sabotaging the ability of the prefrontal lobe to maintain working memory. That's why when we're emotionally upset, we say we just can't think straight, and why continual emotional distress can create deficits in a child's intellectual abilities, crippling the capacity to learn. These deficits, if more subtle, aren't always tapped by IQ testing, though they do show up in a child's continual agitation and impulsivity. In one study, for example, primary school boys who had above-average IQ scores, but nevertheless were doing poorly in school, were found via these neuropsychological tests to have impaired frontal cortex functioning. Consider, too, the role of emotions in even the most rational decision-making. Dr. Antonio Damasio, a neurologist at the University of Iowa College of Medicine, has made careful studies of just what's impaired in patients with damage to the prefrontal amygdala circuit. Their decision-making is terribly flawed, and yet they show no deterioration at all in IQ or any cognitive ability. Despite their intact intelligence, they make disastrous choices in business and their personal lives, and even obsess endlessly over a decision so simple as when to make an appointment. Dr. Damasio argues that their decisions are so bad because they've lost access to their emotional learning. Evidence leads Dr. Damasio to the counterintuitive position that feelings are typically indispensable for rational decisions. They point us in the proper direction, where dry logic can then be of best use. Ordinarily, the complementarity of limbic system and neocortex, amygdala and prefrontal lobes, means each is a full partner in mental life. When these partners interact well, emotional intelligence rises, as does intellectual ability. The old paradigm held an ideal of reason freed of the pull of emotion. The new paradigm urges us to harmonize head and heart. To do that well in our lives means we must first understand more exactly what it means to use emotion intelligently. One of psychology's open secrets is the relative inability of grades, IQ, or SAT scores, despite their popular mystique, to predict unerringly who will succeed in life. To be sure, there's a relationship between IQ and life circumstances for large groups as a whole. Many people with very low IQs end up in menial jobs, and those with high IQs tend to become well paid, but by no means always. My concern is with emotional intelligence. Abilities such as being able to motivate oneself and persist in the face of frustrations, to control impulse and delay gratification, to regulate one's moods and keep distress from swamping the ability to think, to empathize, and to hope. IQ offers little to explain the different destinies of people with roughly equal promise, schooling, and opportunity. When 95 Harvard students from the classes of the 1940s were followed into middle age, the men with the highest test scores in college weren't particularly successful compared to the lower-scoring peers in terms of salary, productivity, or status in their field. Nor did they have the greatest life satisfaction, nor the most happiness with friendships, family, and romantic relationships. And that's the problem. Academic intelligence offers virtually no preparation for the turmoil or opportunity life's vicissitudes bring. Yet even though a high IQ is no guarantee of prosperity, prestige, or happiness in life, our schools and our culture fixate on academic abilities, ignoring emotional intelligence. Emotional life is a domain that, as surely as math or reading, can be handled with greater or lesser skill and requires its unique set of competencies. Emotional aptitude is a meta-ability, determining how well we can use whatever other skills we have, including raw intellect. Much evidence testifies that people who are emotionally adept, who know and manage their own feelings well and who read and deal effectively with other people's feelings, are at an advantage in any domain of life, whether romance and intimate relationships or picking up on the unspoken rules that govern success in organizational politics. To the casual observer, 4-year-old Judy might seem a wallflower among her more gregarious playmates. She hangs back from the action at playtime, staying on the margins of games rather than plunging into the center. But Judy is actually a keen observer of the social politics of her preschool classroom, perhaps the most sophisticated of her playmates in her insights into the tides of feeling within the others. Her sophistication is not apparent until Judy's teacher gathers the 4-year-olds around to play what they call the classroom game. The classroom game, a dollhouse replica of Judy's own preschool classroom with stick figures who have for heads small photos of the students and teachers, is a test of social perceptiveness. When Judy's teacher asks her to put each girl and boy in the part of the room they like to play in most, the art corner, the blocks corner, and so on, Judy does so with complete accuracy. And when asked to put each boy and girl with the children they like to play with most, Judy shows she can match best friends for the entire class. Judy's accuracy reveals that she has a perfect social map of her class, a level of perceptiveness exceptional for a 4-year-old. These are the skills that in later life might allow Judy to blossom into a star in any of the fields where people skills count, from sales and management to diplomacy. That Judy's social brilliance was spotted at all, let alone this early, was due to her being a student in Project Spectrum, a curriculum that intentionally cultivates a variety of kinds of intelligence. The guiding visionary behind Project Spectrum is Howard Gardner, a psychologist at the Harvard School of Education. The time has come, Gardner told me, to broaden our notion of the spectrum of talents. Project Spectrum recognizes that the human repertoire of abilities goes far beyond the 3 R's, that narrow band of word and number skills that schools traditionally focus on. It acknowledges that capacities such as Judy's social perceptiveness are talents that an education can nurture rather than ignore or even frustrate. By encouraging children to develop a full range of the abilities that they'll actually draw on to succeed, or use simply to be fulfilled in what they do, school becomes an education in life skills. In recent years, a growing group of psychologists agree with Gardner that the old concepts of IQ revolved around a narrow band of linguistic and math skills, and that doing well on IQ tests was most directly a predictor of success in the classroom or as a professor, but less and less so as life's paths diverge from academe. These psychologists have taken a wider view of intelligence, trying to reinvent it in terms of what it takes to lead life successfully, and that line of inquiry leads back to an appreciation of just how crucial personal or emotional intelligence really is. Yale psychologist Peter Salovey subsumes Gardner's personal intelligence in his basic definition of emotional intelligence, expanding these abilities into 5 main domains. The first is knowing one's emotions. Self-awareness, recognizing a feeling as it happens, is the keystone of emotional intelligence. The second is managing emotions. Handling feelings so that they're appropriate is an ability that builds on self-awareness. The third, motivating oneself. Fourth, recognizing emotions in others. Empathy, another ability that builds on emotional self-awareness, is the fundamental people skill. The fifth is handling relationships. The art of relationships is, in large part, skill in managing emotions in others. IQ and emotional intelligence are not opposing competencies, but rather separate ones. However, unlike the familiar test for IQ, there is as yet no single paper and pencil test that yields an emotional intelligence score, and there may never be one. A belligerent samurai, an old Japanese tale goes, once challenged a Zen master to explain the concept of heaven and hell. But the monk replied with scorn, "You're nothing but a lout. I can't waste my time with the likes of you." His very honor attacked, the samurai flew into a rage, and pulling his sword from its scabbard, yelled, "I could kill you for your impertinence." "That," the monk calmly replied, "is hell." Startled at seeing the truth in what the master pointed out about the fury that had him in its grip, the samurai calmed down, sheathed his sword, and bowed, thanking the monk for the insight. "And that," said the monk, "is heaven." The sudden awakening of the samurai to his own agitated state illustrates the crucial difference between being caught up in a feeling and becoming aware that you're being swept away by it. Socrates' injunction, "Know thyself," speaks to this keystone of emotional intelligence, awareness of one's own feelings as they occur, self-awareness in the sense of an ongoing attention to one's internal states. Self-awareness, in short, means being aware of both our mood and our thoughts about that mood, in the words of John Mayer, a University of New Hampshire psychologist, who with Yale's Peter Salovey is a co-formulator of the theory of emotional intelligence. Self-awareness can be a non-reactive, non-judgmental attention to inner states. Mayer finds that people tend to fall into distinctive styles for attending to and dealing with their emotions. Some people are self-aware, aware of their moods as they're having them. These people understandably have some sophistication about their emotional lives. Their mindfulness helps them manage their emotions. Some people are engulfed. These are people who often feel swamped by their emotions and helpless to escape them, as though their moods have taken charge. Some people are accepting. While these people are often clear about what they're feeling, they also tend to be accepting of their moods and so don't try to change them. At the extremes, this means that for some people, emotional awareness is overwhelming, while for others it barely exists. Gary infuriated his fiancée, Ellen, because even though he was intelligent, thoughtful, and a successful surgeon, he was emotionally flat, completely unresponsive to any and all shows of feeling. While Gary could speak brilliantly of science and art, when it came to his feelings, even those for Ellen, he fell silent. Try as she might to elicit some passion from him, Gary was impassive, oblivious. "I don't naturally express my feelings," Gary told the therapist he saw at Ellen's insistence. When it came to emotional life, he added, "I don't know what to talk about. I have no strong feelings, either positive or negative." Ellen was not alone in being frustrated by Gary's aloofness. As he confided to his therapist, he was unable to speak openly about his feelings with anyone in his life. The reason? He didn't know what he felt in the first place. So far as he could tell, he had no angers, no sadnesses, no joys. As his own therapist observes, this emotional blankness makes Gary and others like him colorless, bland. They bore everybody. That's why their wives send them into treatment. Gary's emotional flatness exemplifies what psychiatrists call alexithymia. It's not that alexithymics never feel, but that they're unable to know, and especially unable to put into words, precisely what their feelings are. They're utterly lacking in the fundamental skill of emotional intelligence, self-awareness, knowing what we're feeling as emotions roil within us. Alexithymics belie the common-sense notion that it's perfectly self-evident what we're feeling. They haven't a clue. Elliot's tumor, growing just behind his forehead, was the size of a small orange. Surgery removed it completely. Although the surgery was declared a success, afterward people who knew him well said that Elliot was no longer Elliot. He had undergone a drastic personality change. Once a successful corporate lawyer, Elliot could no longer hold a job. His wife left him. Squandering his savings in fruitless investments, he was reduced to living in a spare bedroom at his brother's house. Antonio Damasio, the neurologist Elliot consulted, was struck by one element missing from Elliot's mental repertoire. Though nothing was wrong with his logic, memory, attention, or any other cognitive ability, Elliot was virtually oblivious to his feelings about what had happened to him. Most strikingly, Elliot could narrate the tragic events of his life with complete dispassion, as though he were an onlooker to the losses and failures of his past, without a note of regret or sadness, frustration or anger at life's unfairness. His own tragedy brought him no pain. Damasio felt more upset by Elliot's story than did Elliot himself. The source of this emotional unawareness, Damasio concluded, was the removal, along with the brain tumor, of part of Elliot's prefrontal lobes. In effect, the surgery had severed ties between the lower centers of the emotional brain, especially the amygdala and related circuits, and the thinking abilities of the neocortex. Elliot's thinking had become computer-like, able to make every step in the calculus of a decision, but unable to assign values to differing possibilities. Every option was neutral. And that overly dispassionate reasoning, suspected Damasio, was the core of Elliot's problem. Too little awareness of his own feelings about things made Elliot's reasoning faulty. The handicap showed up even in mundane decisions. When Damasio tried to choose a time and date for the next appointment with Elliot, the result was a muddle of indecisiveness. Eliot could find arguments for and against every date and time that Damasio proposed, but could not choose among them. At the rational level, there were perfectly good reasons for objecting to or accepting virtually every possible time for the appointment. But Eliot lacked any sense of how he felt about any of the times. Lacking that awareness of his own feelings, he had no preferences at all. The intuitive signals that guide us in these moments come in the form of limbic-driven surges from the viscera that Damasio calls somatic markers, literally gut feelings. The somatic marker is a kind of automatic alarm, typically calling attention to a potential danger from a given course of action. More often than not, these markers steer us away from some choice that experience warns us against, though they can also alert us to a golden opportunity. A sense of self-mastery, of being able to withstand the emotional storms that the buffeting of fortune brings, rather than being slave to passion, has been praised as a virtue since the time of Plato. The Romans and the early Christian Church called it temperance, the restraining of emotional excess. The goal is balance, not emotional suppression. Every feeling has its value and significance. But as Aristotle observed, what's wanted is appropriate emotion, feeling proportionate to circumstance. When emotions are too muted, they create dullness and distance. When out of control, too extreme and persistent, they become pathological, as in immobilizing depression, overwhelming anxiety, raging anger, or manic agitation. Still, managing our emotions is something of a full-time job. Much of what we do, especially in our free time, is an attempt to manage mood. Everything from reading a novel or watching TV to the activities and companions we choose can be a way to make ourselves feel better. The art of soothing ourselves is a fundamental life skill. Some psychoanalytic thinkers see this as one of the most essential of all psychic tools. The theory holds that emotionally sound infants learn to soothe themselves by treating themselves as their caretakers have treated them, leaving them less vulnerable to the upheavals of the emotional brain. Say someone in another car cuts dangerously close to you as you're driving on the freeway. If your reflexive thought is, "That son of a bitch," it matters immensely for the trajectory of rage whether that thought is followed by more thoughts of outrage and revenge, like, "He could have hit me, that bastard! I can't let him get away with that." Your knuckles whiten as you tighten your hold on the steering wheel, a surrogate for strangling his throat. Your body mobilizes to fight, not run, leaving you trembling, beads of sweat on your forehead, your heart pounding, the muscles in your face locked in a scowl. Contrast that sequence of building rage with a more charitable line of thought toward the driver who cut you off. Something like, maybe he didn't see me, or maybe he had some good reason for driving so carelessly, like a medical emergency. That line of possibility tempers anger with mercy, or at least an open mind, short-circuiting the buildup of rage. The problem, as Aristotle's challenge to have only appropriate anger reminds us, is that more often than not our anger surges out of control. Ben Franklin put it well. Anger, said he, is never without a reason, but seldom a good one. Of all the moods that people want to escape, rage seems to be the most intransigent. Diana Tice, a psychologist at Case Western Reserve University, found that anger is the mood people are worst at controlling. The train of angry thoughts that stoke anger is also potentially the key to one of the most powerful ways to diffuse anger, undermining the convictions that are fueling the anger in the first place. Tice found that reframing a situation more positively was one of the most potent ways to put anger to rest. That finding squares well with the conclusions of University of Alabama psychologist Dolph Zillman, who sees two main ways of intervening. One way of diffusing anger is to seize on and challenge the thoughts that trigger the surges of anger, since it's the original appraisal of an interaction that confirms and encourages that first burst of anger and the subsequent reappraisals that fan the flames. Timing matters. The earlier in the anger cycle, the more effective. Indeed, anger can be completely short-circuited if the mitigating information comes before the anger is acted on. Here's some relevant testimony. Once when I was about 13, in an angry fit, I walked out of the house vowing I would never return. It was a beautiful summer day, and I walked far along lovely lanes till gradually the stillness and beauty calmed and soothed me, and after some hours I returned repentant and almost melted. Since then, when I'm angry, I do this if I can, and I find it the best cure. That account is by a subject in one of the very first scientific studies of anger, done in 1899. It still stands as a model of a second way of de-escalating anger, cooling off physiologically by waiting out the adrenal surge in a setting where there are not likely to be further triggers for rage. But a cooling down period won't work if that time is used to pursue the train of anger-inducing thought, since each such thought is in itself a minor trigger for more cascades of anger. The power of distraction is that it stops that angry train of thought. Catharsis, that is, giving vent to rage, is sometimes extolled as a way of handling anger. The popular theory holds that it makes you feel better, but as Zillman's findings suggest, there's an argument against catharsis. It's been made since the 1950s, when psychologists started to test the effects of catharsis experimentally, and time after time found that giving vent to anger did little or nothing to dispel it. Tice found that ventilating anger is one of the worst ways to cool down. Outbursts of rage typically pump up the emotional brain's arousal, leaving people feeling more angry, not less. As I once heard Chogyam Trungpa, a Tibetan teacher, reply when asked how best to handle anger, "Don't suppress it, but don't act on it." Oh no, the muffler sounds bad. What if I have to take it to the shop? I can't afford the expense. I'd have to draw the money from Jamie's college fund. What if I can't afford his tuition? That bad school report last week. What if his grades go down and he can't get into college? That muffler sounds so bad. And so the worrying mind spins on in an endless loop of low-grade melodrama, one set of concerns leading on to the next and back again. That last specimen was offered by Elizabeth Romer and Thomas Borkovec, Pennsylvania State University psychologists, whose research on worrying, the heart of all anxiety, has raised the topic from neurotics art to science. There is, of course, no hitch when worry works. By mulling over a problem, a solution might appear. Worry is, in a sense, a rehearsal of what might go wrong and how to deal with it. The difficulty is with chronic, repetitive worries, the kind that recycle on and never get any nearer a positive solution. When this same cycle of worry intensifies and persists, it shades over the line into full-blown neural hijackings, the anxiety disorders, phobias, obsessions and compulsions, panic attacks. In all these conditions, the common denominator is worry run amok. Chronic worriers worry about a wide range of things, most of which have almost no chance of happening. They read dangers into life's journey that others never notice. The one thing that chronic worriers cannot do is follow the advice they're most often given. That's to just stop worrying. But after much experimentation, Borkovec discovered some simple steps that can help even the most chronic worrier control the habit. The first step is self-awareness, catching the worrisome episodes as near their beginning as possible, ideally as soon as or just after the fleeting catastrophic image triggers the worry-anxiety cycle. Borkovec trains people in this approach by first teaching them to monitor cues for anxiety, as well as the accompanying sensations of anxiety in their body. Worriers also need to actively challenge the worrisome thoughts. Failing this, the worry spiral will keep coming back. So the next step is to take a critical stance toward their assumptions. Is it very probable that the dreaded event will occur? Is it necessarily the case that there's only one or no alternative to letting it happen? Are there constructive steps to be taken? Does it really help to run through these same anxious thoughts over and over? On the other hand, for people with worries so severe they've flowered into phobia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or panic disorder, it may be prudent, indeed a sign of self-awareness, to turn to medication to interrupt the cycle. The single mood people generally put most effort into shaking is sadness. Diana Tice found that people are most inventive when it comes to trying to escape the blues. Of course, not all sadness should be escaped. Melancholy, like every other mood, has its benefits. The sadness that a loss brings has certain invariable effects. It closes down our interest in diversions and pleasures, fixes attention on what's been lost, and saps our energy for starting new endeavors, at least for the time being. Bereavement is useful. Full-blown depression is not. William Styron renders an eloquent description of the many dreadful manifestations of the disease, among them the self-hatred, a sense of worthlessness, a dank joylessness with gloom crowding in on me, a sense of dread and alienation, and above all a stifling anxiety. In such major depression, life is paralyzed. No new beginnings emerge. The very symptoms of depression bespeak a life on hold. For Styron, no medication or therapy helped. It was the passing of time and the refuge of a hospital that finally cleared away the despondency. For most people, especially those with less severe cases, psychotherapy can help, as can medication. Prozac is the treatment of the hour, but there are more than a dozen other compounds offering some help, especially for major depression. My focus here is the far more common sadness, ordinary melancholy. This is a range of despondency that people can handle on their own if they have the internal resources. Tice found the most popular tactic for battling depression is socializing, going out to eat, to a ball game or movie, in short, doing something with friends or family. One of the main determinants of whether a depressed mood will persist or lift is the degree to which people ruminate. Stanford psychologist Susan Nolan Hoekstra, who has studied rumination in depressed people, finds women are far more prone to ruminate when they're depressed than are men. This, she proposes, may at least partly explain the fact that women are diagnosed with depression twice as often as men, though men may drown their depression in alcoholism, for which their rate is about twice that of women. Cognitive therapy aimed at changing these thought patterns has been found in some studies to be on a par with medication for treating mild clinical depression and superior to medication in preventing the return of mild depression. Two strategies are particularly effective in the battle. One is to learn to challenge the thoughts at the center of rumination, to question their validity and think of more positive alternatives. The other is to purposely schedule pleasant, distracting events. Diane Tice found that many people reported turning to distractions such as reading, TV and movies, video games and puzzles, sleeping, and daydreams such as planning a fantasy vacation. Another constructive approach to mood lifting, Tice reports, is engineering a small triumph for easy success, tackling some long-delayed chore around the house or getting to some other duty they've been wanting to clear up. One of the most potent and, outside therapy, little-used antidotes to depression is seeing things differently, or cognitive reframing. It's all too easy to bemoan the end of a relationship and wallow in self-pitying thoughts like the conviction that this means I'll always be alone, but it's sure to thicken the sense of despair. But stepping back and thinking about the ways the relationship wasn't so great, ways you and your partner didn't click, in other words, seeing the loss differently in a more positive light, is an antidote to the sadness. Another effective depression lifter is helping others in need. Throwing oneself into volunteer work, coaching Little League, being a big brother, feeding the homeless, was one of the most powerful mood changers in Tice's study. But it's also one of the rarest. Finally, at least some people are able to find relief from their melancholy in turning to a transcendent power. Tice told me that praying, if you're very religious, works for all moods, especially depression. Just once in my life have I been paralyzed by fear. The occasion was a calculus exam during my freshman year in college, for which I somehow had managed not to study. As I opened the blue cover of my exam book, there was a thump in my ears of heartbeat. There was the taste of anxiety in the pit of my stomach. I looked at the exam questions once, quickly. Hopeless. For an hour I stared at that page, my mind racing over the consequences I'd suffer. What strikes me most about that dreadful moment was how constricted my mind became. I didn't spend the hour in a desperate attempt to patch together some semblance of answers to the test. I didn't daydream. I simply sat fixated on my terror, waiting for the ordeal to finish. That narrative of an ordeal by terror is my own. To this day, it's for me the most convincing evidence of the devastating impact of emotional distress on mental clarity. I now see that my ordeal was most likely a testament to the power of the emotional brain to overpower, even paralyze, the thinking brain. When emotions overwhelm concentration, what's being swamped is working memory, the ability to hold in mind all information relevant to the task at hand. On the other hand, consider the role of positive motivation, the marshalling of feelings of enthusiasm, zeal, and confidence in achievement. Studies of Olympic athletes, world-class musicians, and chess grandmasters find their unifying trait is the ability to motivate themselves to pursue relentless training routines. For world-level competitors, these rigorous training routines now increasingly have to begin in childhood. The added payoff for life success for motivation can be seen in the remarkable performance of Asian students in American schools and professions. One thorough review of the evidence suggests that Asian American children have an average IQ advantage over whites of just 2 or 3 points, but the careers they enter, like dentistry, suggest an IQ advantage of 10 or 20 points. The reason seems to be that from the earliest years of school, Asian children work harder than whites. Sanford Dornbush, a Stanford sociologist who studied more than 10,000 high school students, found that Asian Americans spent 40% more time doing homework than did other students. Their families believe that anyone can do well in school with the right effort. In short, a strong cultural work ethic translates into higher motivation, zeal, and persistence. That's an emotional edge. Just imagine you're 4 years old and someone makes the following proposal. If you'll wait until after he runs an errand, you can have 2 marshmallows for a treat. If you can't wait until then, you can have only 1, but you can have it right now. It's a challenge sure to try the soul of any 4-year-old, a microcosm of the eternal battle between impulse and restraint, id and ego, desire and self-control, gratification and delay. Which of these choices a child makes is a telling test. It offers a quick reading not just of character, but of the trajectory that child will probably take through life. In a remarkable study during the 1960s at a preschool on the Stanford University campus, the Marshmallow Challenge was posed to 4-year-olds. It shows just how fundamental is the ability to restrain the emotions and so delay impulse. Some 4-year-olds were able to wait what must surely have seemed an endless 15 to 20 minutes for the experimenter to return. To sustain themselves in their struggle, they covered their eyes so they wouldn't have to stare at temptation, or rested their heads in their arms, talked to themselves, sang, played games with their hands and feet, even tried to go to sleep. These plucky preschoolers got the 2 marshmallow reward, but others, more impulsive, grabbed that 1 marshmallow, almost within seconds of the experimenter's leaving the room on his so-called errand. The diagnostic power of how this moment of impulse was handled became clear some 12 to 14 years later when these same children were tracked down as adolescents. The emotional and social difference between the grab-the-marshmallow preschoolers and their gratification-delaying peers was dramatic. Those who had resisted temptation at 4 were now, as adolescents, more socially competent, personally effective, self-assertive, and better able to cope with the frustrations of life. They embraced challenges and were self-reliant and confident, trustworthy and dependable. And more than a decade later, they were still able to delay gratification in pursuit of their goals. The third or so who grabbed for the marshmallow, however, tended to have fewer of these qualities and shared instead a relatively more troubled psychological portrait. In adolescence, they were more likely to be seen as shying away from social contacts, to be stubborn and indecisive, to be easily upset by frustrations, to think of themselves as bad or unworthy. And after all those years, they still were unable to put off gratification. Most astonishingly, those who had waited patiently at 4 had dramatically higher scores on their SAT tests, a 210-point advantage. At age 4, how children do on this test of delay of gratification is twice as powerful a predictor of what their eventual SAT scores will be as is IQ at age 4. IQ becomes a stronger predictor of SAT only after children learn to read. This suggests that the ability to delay gratification contributes powerfully to intellectual potential, quite apart from IQ itself. College students were posed the following hypothetical situation. Although you set your goal of getting a B when your first exam score, that's worth 30% of your final grade, comes back, you've received a D. It's now 1 week after you learned about the D. What do you do? Hope made all the difference. The response by students with high levels of hope was to work harder and think of a range of things they could try that might bolster their final grade. Students with moderate levels of hope thought of several ways they might up their grade but had far less determination to pursue them. And, understandably, students with low levels of hope gave up on both counts, demoralized. From the perspective of emotional intelligence, having hope means that one will not give in to overwhelming anxiety, a defeatist attitude, or depression in the face of difficult challenges or setbacks. Indeed, people who are hopeful evidence less depression than others as they maneuver through life in pursuit of their goals. They're less anxious in general, and they have less emotional distress. One of the most telling demonstrations of the power of optimism to motivate people is a study Martin Seligman, a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, did of insurance salesmen with the MetLife Company. Being able to take a rejection with grace is essential in sales of all kinds, especially with a product like insurance, where the ratio of no's to yeses can be so discouragingly high. For this reason, about 3/4 of insurance salesmen quit in their first 3 years. Seligman found that new salesmen who were by nature optimists sold 37% more insurance in their first 2 years on the job than did pessimists. And during that first year, the pessimists quit at twice the rate of the optimists. Just why optimism makes such a difference in sales success speaks to the sense in which it's an emotionally intelligent attitude. Each no a salesperson gets is a small defeat. The emotional reaction to that defeat is crucial to the ability to marshal enough motivation to continue. As the no's mount up, morale can deteriorate, making it harder and harder to pick up the phone for the next call. Such rejection is especially hard to take for a pessimist, who interprets it as meaning, "I'm a failure at this, I'll never make a sale," an interpretation that's sure to trigger apathy and defeatism, if not depression. Optimists, on the other hand, tell themselves, "I'm using the wrong approach," or "that last person was just in a bad mood." By seeing not themselves, but something in the situation as the reason for their failure, they can change their approach in the next call. While the pessimist's mental set leads to despair, the optimist spawns hope. A composer describes those moments when his work is at its best. You're in an ecstatic state to such a point that you feel as though you almost don't exist. I've experienced this time and again. My hand seems devoid of myself. I have nothing to do with what's happening. I just sit there watching in a state of awe and wonderment, and it just flows out by itself. His description is remarkably similar to those of hundreds of diverse men and women, rock climbers, chess champions, surgeons, basketball players, engineers, managers, even filing clerks, when they tell of a time they outdid themselves in some favorite activity. The state they describe is called flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the University of Chicago psychologist who has collected such accounts of peak performance during 2 decades of research. Athletes know this state of grace as the zone, where excellence becomes effortless, crowd and competitors disappearing into a blissful, steady absorption in the moment. Being able to enter flow is emotional intelligence at its best. Flow represents perhaps the ultimate in harnessing the emotions in the service of performance and learning. In flow, the emotions are not just contained and channeled, but positive, energized, aligned with the task at hand. To be caught in the ennui of depression or the agitation of anxiety is to be barred from flow. Because flow emerges in the zone in which an activity challenges people to the fullest of their capacities, as their skills increase, it takes a heightened challenge to get into flow. If a task is too simple, it's boring. If too challenging, the result is anxiety rather than flow. Howard Gardner, the Harvard psychologist who developed the theory of multiple intelligences, sees flow and the positive states that typify it as part of the healthiest way to teach children, motivating them from the inside rather than by threat or promise of reward. We should use kids' positive states to draw them into learning in the domains where they can develop competencies, Gardner proposed to me. Flow is an internal state that signifies a kid is engaged in a task that's right. You have to find something you like and stick to it. It's when kids get bored in school that they fight and act up, and when they're overwhelmed by a challenge that they get anxious about their schoolwork. But you learn at your best when you have something you care about and get pleasure from being engaged in. Back to Gary, the brilliant but alexithymic surgeon who so distressed his fiancée, Ellen, by being oblivious not only to his own feelings, but to hers as well. Like most alexithymics, he lacked empathy as well as insight. Empathy builds on self-awareness. The more open we are to our own emotions, the more skilled we will be in reading other people's. Alexithymics like Gary are emotionally tone-deaf. That capacity, the ability to know how another feels, comes into play in a vast array of life arenas, from sales and management to romance and parenting to compassion and political action. The absence of empathy is also telling. Its lack is seen in criminal psychopaths, rapists, and child molesters. People's emotions are rarely put into words. Far more often they're expressed through other cues. The key to intuiting another's feelings is in the ability to read nonverbal channels, tone of voice, gesture, facial expression, and the like. In tests with over 7,000 people in the U.S. and 18 other countries, the benefits of being able to read feelings from nonverbal cues included being better adjusted emotionally, more popular, more outgoing, and perhaps not surprisingly, more sensitive. In general, women are better than men at this kind of empathy. The moment Hope, just 9 months old, saw another baby fall, tears welled up in her own eyes, and she crawled off to be comforted by her mother, as though it were she who had been hurt. And 15-month-old Michael went to get his own teddy bear for his crying friend Paul. When Paul kept crying, Michael retrieved Paul's security blanket for him. Both these small acts of sympathy and caring were observed by mothers trained to record such incidents of empathy in action. The results of the study suggest that the roots of empathy can be traced to infancy. Virtually from the day they're born, infants are upset when they hear another infant crying, a response some see as the earliest precursor of empathy. Developmental psychologists have found that infants feel sympathetic distress even before they fully realize that they exist apart from other people. Even a few months after birth, infants react to a disturbance in those around them as though it were their own, crying when they see another child's tears. On seeing his mother cry, one baby wiped his own eyes, though they had no tears. Such motor mimicry, as it's called, fades from toddlers' repertoire at around 2.5 years, at which point they realize that someone else's pain is different from their own. Daniel Stern, a psychiatrist at Cornell University School of Medicine, is fascinated by the small, repeated exchanges that take place between parent and child. He believes that the most basic lessons of emotional life are laid down in these intimate moments. Of all such moments, the most critical are those that let the child know her emotions are met with empathy, accepted and reciprocated, in a process Stern calls attunement. Stern contends that the countlessly repeated moments of attunement or misattunement between parent and child shape the emotional expectations adults bring to their close relationships, perhaps far more than the more dramatic events of childhood. Attunement is very different from simple imitation. If you just imitate a baby, Stern told me, that only shows you know what he did, not how he felt. To let him know you sense how he feels, you have to play back his inner feelings in another way. Then the baby knows he's understood. The lifetime emotional costs of lack of attunement in childhood can be great, not just for the child. A study of criminals who committed the cruelest and most violent crimes found that neglect set them apart from other criminals. They'd been shuttled from foster home to foster home or raised in orphanages, life histories that suggest little opportunity for attunement. Never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. That's one of the most famous lines in English literature. John Donne's sentiment speaks to the heart of the link between empathy and caring. Another's pain is one's own. To feel with another is to care. The empathic attitude is engaged again and again in moral judgments for dilemmas involving potential victims. Should you lie to keep from hurting a friend's feelings? Should you keep a promise to visit a sick friend or accept a last-minute invitation to a dinner party instead? When should a life support system be kept going for someone who would otherwise die? These moral questions are posed by the empathy researcher Martin Hoffman, who argues that the roots of morality are to be found in empathy, since it's empathizing with the potential victims, someone in pain, danger, or deprivation, say, and so sharing their distress, that moves people to act to help them. Hoffman sees a natural progression in empathy from infancy onward. By late childhood, the most advanced level of empathy emerges as children are able to understand distress beyond the immediate situation and to see that someone's condition or station in life may be a source of chronic distress. At this point, they can feel for the plight of an entire group, such as the poor, the oppressed, the outcast. That understanding in adolescence can buttress moral convictions centered on wanting to alleviate misfortune and injustice. Empathy is typically and tragically lacking in those who commit the most mean-spirited of crimes. A psychological fault line is common to rapists, child molesters, and many perpetrators of family violence alike. They are incapable of empathy. This inability to feel the victim's pain allows them to tell themselves lies that encourage their crime. For rapists, the lies include, "Women really want to be raped," or "If she resists, she's just playing hard to get." For molesters, it's, "I'm not hurting the child, just showing love," or "This is just another form of affection." For physically abusive parents, it's "This is just good discipline." As so often happens to 5-year-olds with younger siblings, Len has lost all patience with Jay, his 2.5-year-old brother, who's making a mess of the Lego blocks they've been playing with. Carried away by a wave of rage, Len bites Jay, who breaks into tears. Their mother, hearing Jay's pain yelp, bustles over and scolds Len, ordering him to put away these objects of contention, the Lego blocks. At this, what surely must seem a gross miscarriage of justice, Len bursts out crying. Still peeved, his mother refuses to console him. But Len is proffered comfort from an unlikely source, Jay, who, although the original injured party, is now so concerned by his older brother's tears that he undertakes a campaign to calm Len down. He says, "Len, don't. Stop crying." But Len still cries. His direct plea a failure, Jay beseeches their mother on Len's behalf. "Len crying, Mummy. Look, me show you Len crying." And then turning to Len, Jay adopts a mothering mode, patting his weeping brother as he reassures him in soothing tones. "Look, Len, no go on crying." Len's sobs continue, so Jay turns to another tactic, lending a helping hand in putting away the Lego blocks in their bag. "I put it back for Lenny." Even so, the tears continue. The ever-ingenious Jay tries yet another strategy, distraction. Showing his brother a toy car, Jay tries to draw his attention away from the minor tragedy that's just befallen him. "There's this man in here. What's this, Len?" Len takes no interest. He's inconsolable. His tears know no end. Losing her patience with him, his mother resorts to that classic parental threat. "Do you want me to smack you? Then just stop it, please." Len manages a pathetic, "I'm trying to," which prompts Jay's final stratagem. Borrowing his mother's firmness and voice of authority, he threatens, "Stop crying, Len. Smack your bottom." This microdrama reveals the remarkable emotional sophistication that a toddler of just 30 months can bring to bear in trying to manage someone else's emotions. In his urgent attempts to soothe his brother, Jay is able to draw on a large repertoire of tactics ranging from a simple plea, to seeking an ally in his mother, to physically comforting him, to lending a helping hand, to distraction, threats, and direct commands. No doubt Jay relies on an arsenal that has been tried with him in his own moments of distress. No matter. What counts is that he can readily put them to use in a pinch, even at this very young age. To manifest such interpersonal power, toddlers must first reach a benchmark of self-control, the beginnings of the capacity to damp down their own anger and distress, their impulses and excitement, even if that ability usually falters. Attunement to others demands a modicum of calm in oneself. Tentative signs of this ability to manage their own emotions emerge around this same period. Patience emerges as an alternative to tantrums, at least occasionally, and signs of empathy emerge by age 2. It was Jay's empathy, the root of compassion, that drove him to try so hard to cheer up his sobbing brother Len. Thus, handling emotions in someone else, the fine art of relationships, requires the rightness of 2 other emotional skills, self-management and empathy. With this base, the people skills ripen. These are the social competencies that make for effectiveness in dealings with others. Deficits here lead to ineptness in the social world or repeated interpersonal disasters. Indeed, it's precisely the lack of these skills that can cause even the intellectually brightest to founder in their relationships, coming off as arrogant, obnoxious, or insensitive. These social abilities allow one to shape an encounter, to mobilize and inspire others, to thrive in intimate relationships, to persuade and influence, to put others at ease. It's recess at a preschool, and a band of boys is running across the grass. Reggie trips, hurts his knee, and starts crying, but the other boys keep right on running, except for Roger, who stops As Reggie's sobs subside, Roger reaches down and rubs his own knee, calling out, "I hurt my knee too." Roger is cited as having exemplary interpersonal intelligence by Thomas Hatch, a colleague of Howard Gardner at Spectrum, the school based on the concept of multiple intelligences. Roger, it seems, is unusually adept at recognizing the feelings of his playmates and making rapid, smooth connections with them. It was only Roger who noticed Reggie's plight and pain, and only Roger who tried to provide some solace, even if all he could offer was rubbing his own knee. This small gesture bespeaks a talent for rapport, an emotional skill essential for the preservation of close relationships, whether in a marriage, a friendship, or a business partnership. Such skills in preschoolers are the buds of talents that ripen through life. Roger's talent represents one of 4 separate abilities that Hatch and Gardner identify as components of interpersonal intelligence. The components include organizing groups, the essential skill of the leader. This involves initiating and coordinating the efforts of a network of people. Another is negotiating solutions, the talent of the mediator, preventing conflicts or resolving those that flare up. Another is personal connection, Roger's talent, that of empathy and connecting. It's the art of relationship. Finally, there's social analysis, being able to detect and have insights about people's feelings, motives, and concerns. Taken together, these skills are the stuff of interpersonal polish, the necessary ingredients for charm, social success, even charisma. If the test of social skill is the ability to calm distressing emotions in others, then handling someone at the peak of rage is perhaps the ultimate measure of mastery. Such refined skill in the fine art of emotional influence is perhaps best exemplified by a story told by an old friend, the late Terry Dobson, who in the 1950s was one of the first Americans ever to study the martial art Aikido in Japan. One afternoon, Terry was riding home on a suburban Tokyo train when a huge, bellicose, very drunk and begrimed laborer got on. The man, staggering, began terrorizing the passengers. Screaming curses, he took a swing at a woman holding a baby, sending her sprawling into the laps of an elderly couple, who then jumped up and joined a stampede to the other end of the car. The drunk grabbed the metal pole in the middle of the car with a roar and tried to tear it out of its socket. At that point, Terry, who was in peak physical condition from daily 8-hour Aikido workouts, felt called upon to intervene lest someone get seriously hurt. But he recalled the words of his teacher, "Aikido is the art of reconciliation. Whoever has the mind to fight has broken his connection with the universe. If you try to dominate people, you are already defeated. We study how to resolve conflict, not how to start it." Terry stood up, slowly and with deliberation. Seeing him, the drunk roared, "Aha! A foreigner! You need a lesson in Japanese manners!" But just as the drunk was on the verge of making his move, someone gave an ear-splitting, oddly joyous shout, "Hey!" The shout had the cheery tone of someone who has suddenly come upon a fond friend. The drunk, surprised, spun around to see a tiny Japanese man, probably in his 70s. The old man beamed with delight at the drunk and beckoned him over with a light wave of his hand and a lilting, "Hey, come here!" The drunk strode over with a belligerent, "Why the hell should I talk to you?" Meanwhile, Terry was ready to fell the drunk in a moment if he made the least violent move. "What you been drinking?" said the old man. "I've been drinking sake, and it's none of your business." The old man said, "Oh, that's wonderful. I love sake, too. Every night, me and my wife, we warm up a little bottle of sake and take it out into the garden, and we sit on an old wooden bench." He continued on about the persimmon tree in his backyard, the fortunes of his garden, enjoying sake in the evening. The drunk's face began to soften as he listened to the old man, his fists unclenched. The old man said, "And I'm sure you have a wonderful wife." "No, my wife died." Sobbing, the laborer launched into a sad tale of losing his wife, his home, his job, of being ashamed of himself. Just then the train came to Terry's stop, and as he was getting off, he turned to hear the old man invite the drunk to join him and tell him all about it, and to see the drunk sprawl along the seat, his head in the old man's lap. That is emotional brilliance. To love and to work, Sigmund Freud once remarked to his disciple Erik Erikson, are the twin capacities that mark full maturity. If that's the case, then maturity may be an endangered way station in life, and current trends in marriage and divorce make emotional intelligence more crucial than ever. Consider divorce rates. Although the overall rate of divorce has stopped climbing, the risk of divorce has been shifting to newlyweds. The shift gets clearer in comparing divorce rates for couples wed in a given year. For American marriages that began in 1890, about 10% ended in divorce. For couples married in 1950, 30%. And for married couples starting out in 1990, the likelihood that the marriage would end in divorce was projected to be close to a staggering 67%. If the estimate holds, just 3 in 10 of recent newlyweds can count on staying married to their new partner. She seeks to engage, he withdraws. Marital therapists have long noted that by the time a couple finds their way to the therapy office, they're in this pattern of engage-withdraw, with his complaint about her so-called unreasonable demands and outbursts, and her lamenting his indifference to what she's saying. This marital endgame reflects the fact that there are, in effect, 2 emotional realities in a couple, his and hers. The roots of these emotional differences, while they may be partly biological, also can be traced back to childhood and to the separate emotional worlds boys and girls inhabit while growing up. There's a vast amount of research on these separate worlds, their barriers reinforced not just by the different games boys and girls prefer, but by young children's fear of being teased for having a girlfriend or boyfriend. One study of children's friendships found that 3-year-olds say about half their friends are of the opposite sex. For 5-year-olds, it's about 20%, but by age 7, almost no boys or girls say they have a best friend of the opposite sex. These separate social universes intersect little until teenagers start dating. Meanwhile, boys and girls are taught very different lessons about handling emotions. Parents in general discuss emotions, with the exception of anger, more with their daughters than their sons. Girls are exposed to more information about emotions than are boys. At age 10, roughly the same percent of girls as boys are overtly aggressive, given to open confrontation when angered. But by age 13, a telling difference between the sexes emerges. Girls become more adept than boys at artful aggressive tactics like ostracism, vicious gossip, and indirect vendettas. Boys simply continue being confrontational when argued, oblivious to these more covert strategies. Boys, and later men, are less sophisticated than the opposite sex in the byways of emotional life. When girls play together, they do so in small, intimate groups with an emphasis on minimizing hostility and maximizing cooperation, while boys' games are in larger groups with an emphasis on competition. One key difference can be seen in what happens when games boys or girls are playing get disrupted by someone getting hurt. If a boy who's gotten hurt gets upset, he's expected to get out of the way and stop crying so the game can go on. If the same happens among a group of girls who are playing, the game stops while everyone gathers around to help the girl who's crying. This difference between boys and girls at play epitomizes what Harvard's Carol Gilligan points to as a key disparity between the sexes. Boys take pride in a lone, tough-minded independence and autonomy, while girls see themselves as part of a web of connectedness. This may partly reflect another key difference. Women, on average, experience the entire range of emotions with greater intensity and more volatility than men. In this sense, women are more emotional than men. All of this means that, in general, women come into a marriage groomed for the role of emotional manager, while men arrive with much less appreciation of the importance of this task for helping a relationship survive. How a couple discusses sore points matters greatly for the fate of their marriage. Simply having an agreement about how to disagree is key to marital survival. Men and women have to overcome the innate gender differences in approaching rocky emotions. Failing this, couples are vulnerable to emotional rifts that eventually can tear their relationship apart. These rifts are far more likely to develop if one or both partners have certain deficits in emotional intelligence. Fred, did you pick up my dry cleaning? Ingrid, did you pick up my dry cleaning? Pick up your own damn dry cleaning. What am I, your maid? Fred, hardly. If you were a maid, at least you'd know how to clean. This painfully caustic interchange was between a couple who divorced within the next few years. Their encounter took place in a laboratory run by John Gottman, a psychologist who's done perhaps the most detailed analysis ever of the emotional glue that binds couples together and the corrosive feelings that can destroy marriages. In his laboratory, couples' conversations are videotaped and then subjected to hours of microanalysis designed to reveal the subterranean emotional currents at play. This mapping of the fault lines that may lead a couple to divorce makes a convincing case for the crucial role of emotional intelligence in the survival of a marriage. An early warning signal that a marriage is in danger, Gottman finds, is harsh criticism. In a healthy marriage, husband and wife feel free to voice a complaint, but too often, in the heat of anger, complaints are expressed in a destructive fashion, as an attack on the spouse's character. The differences between complaints and personal criticisms are simple. In a complaint, a wife states specifically what's upsetting her and criticizes her husband's action, not her husband. But personal criticism leaves the person on the receiving end feeling ashamed, disliked, blamed, and defective, all of which are more likely to lead to a defensive response than to steps to improve things. All the more so when the criticism comes laden with contempt, use of mockery or insults such as jerk or bitch. But just as hurtful is the body language that conveys contempt, particularly the sneer or curled lip that are universal facial signals for disgust. The two arms of the fight-or-flight response each represent ways a spouse can respond to an attack. The most obvious is to fight back, lashing out in anger, but the alternative response, fleeing, can be more pernicious, particularly when the flight is a retreat into stony silence. Stonewalling is the ultimate defense. The stonewaller just goes blank, in effect withdrawing from the conversation by responding with a stony expression and silence. Stonewalling sends a powerful, unnerving message, something like a combination of icy distance, superiority, and distaste. As a habitual response, stonewalling is devastating to the health of a relationship. It cuts off all possibility of working out disagreements. The children are being rambunctious, and Martin, their father, is getting annoyed. He turns to his wife, Melanie, and says in a sharp tone, "Dear, don't you think the kids could quiet down?" His actual thought, "She's too easy on the kids." Melanie, responding to his ire, feels a surge of anger. Her face grows taut, her brows knit in a frown, and she replies, "The kids are having a good time. Anyhow, they'll be going to bed soon." Her thought, "There he goes again, complaining all the time." Martin now is visibly enraged. He leans forward, his fist clenched, as he says in an annoyed tone, "Should I put them to bed now?" His thought, "She opposes me in everything. I'd better take over." Melanie, suddenly frightened by Martin's wrath, says meekly, "No, I'll put them to bed right away." Her thought, "He's getting out of control. He could hurt the kids. I'd better give in." This exchange, reported by Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, is an example of the kinds of thinking that can poison a marriage. The real emotional exchange between Melanie and Martin is shaped by their thoughts, and those thoughts, in turn, are determined by another deeper layer, which Beck calls automatic thoughts, fleeting background assumptions about oneself and the people in one's life that reflect our deepest emotional attitudes. For Melanie, the background thought is something like, "He's always bullying me with his anger." For Martin, the key thought is, "She has no right to treat me like this." Melanie feels like an innocent victim in their marriage, and Martin feels righteous indignation at what he feels is unjust treatment. These thoughts are powerful. They trip the neural alarm system. Once the husband's thought of being victimized triggers an emotional hijacking, he will, for the time being, easily call to mind and ruminate on a list of grievances that remind him of the ways she victimizes him, while not recalling anything she may have done in their entire relationship that would disconfirm the view that he is an innocent victim. Partners who are free of such distress-triggering views can entertain a more benign interpretation of what's going on in the same situations, and so they're less likely to have such a hijacking, or, if they do, tend to recover from it more readily. Perhaps the most virulent of such toxic thoughts are found in husbands who are physically violent to their wives. A study of violent husbands by psychologists at Indiana University found that these men think like schoolyard bullies. They read hostile intent into even neutral actions by their wives and use this misreading to justify to themselves their own violence. The net effect of such distressing attitudes is to create incessant crisis. Gottman uses the term flooding for this susceptibility to frequent emotional distress. Flooded husbands or wives are so overwhelmed by their partner's negativity and by their own reaction to it that they're swamped by dreadful, out-of-control feelings. Flooding is a self-perpetuating emotional hijacking. This is perhaps the most dangerous turning point for a marriage, a catastrophic shift in the relationship. Given the grim potential outcome of the differences in how men and women deal with distressing feelings in their relationship, what can couples do to protect the love and affection they feel for each other? In short, what protects a marriage? Men and women in general need different emotional fine-tuning. For men, the advice is not to sidestep conflict, but to realize that when their wife brings up some grievance or disagreement, she may be doing it as an act of love, trying to keep the relationship healthy and on course. Men also need to be on guard against short-circuiting the discussion by offering a practical solution too early on. It's typically more important to a wife that she feel her husband hears her complaint and empathizes with her feelings about the matter, though he need not agree with her. She may hear his offering advice as a way of dismissing her feelings as inconsequential. As for women, the advice is quite parallel. Since a major problem for men is that their wives are too intense in voicing complaints, wives need to make a purposeful effort to be careful not to attack their husbands, to complain about what they did, but not criticize them as a person or express contempt. Complaints are not attacks on character, but rather a clear statement that a particular action is distressing. An angry personal attack will almost certainly lead to a husband's getting defensive or stonewalling, which will be all the more frustrating and only escalate the fight. It helps, too, if a wife's complaints are put in the larger context of reassuring her husband of her love for him. Most notably, missing in couples who eventually divorce are attempts by either partner in an argument to de-escalate the tension. The presence or absence of ways to repair a rift is a crucial difference between the fights of couples who have a healthy marriage and those of couples who eventually end up divorcing. The repair mechanisms are like an emotional thermostat, preventing the feelings being expressed from boiling over and overwhelming the partner's ability to focus on the issue at hand. One overall strategy for making a marriage work is not to concentrate on the specific issues, whether child-rearing, sex, money, or housework, that couples fight about, but rather to cultivate a couple's shared emotional intelligence, thereby improving the chances of working things out. A handful of emotional competencies, mainly being able to calm down and calm your partner, empathy, and listening well, can make it more likely a couple will settle their disagreements effectively. The emotional reactions triggered in marriage touch on some of our deepest needs: to be loved and feel respected, fears of abandonment or of being emotionally deprived. Small wonder we can act in a marital fight as though our very survival were at stake. Even so, nothing gets resolved positively when husband or wife is in the midst of an emotional hijacking. One key marital competence is for partners to learn to soothe their own distressed feelings. Essentially, this means mastering the ability to recover quickly from the flooding caused by an emotional hijacking. Because the ability to hear, think, and speak with clarity dissolves during such an emotional peak, calming down is an immensely constructive step, without which there can be no further progress in settling what's at issue. One method for calming is to have a pre-stated agreement that allows one or another partner to call a timeout at the first signs of flooding in either one. During that timeout period, cooling down can be helped along by engaging in a relaxation technique. Because flooding is triggered by negative thoughts about the partner, it helps if a husband or wife who's being upset by such harsh judgments tackles them head-on. A sentiment like, "I don't deserve this kind of treatment," is an innocent victim or righteous indignation slogan. By catching these thoughts and challenging them, a husband or wife can begin to become free of their hold. Listening is a skill that keeps couples together. The most powerful form of non-defensive listening, of course, is empathy, actually hearing the feelings behind what's being said. Without this physiological attunement, a partner's sense of what the other is feeling is likely to be entirely off base. One method for effective emotional listening, called mirroring, is commonly used in marital therapy. When one partner makes a complaint, the other repeats it back in her own words, trying to capture not just the thought, but also the feelings that go with it. The partner mirroring checks with the other to be sure the restatement is on target, and if not, tries again until it's right, something that seems simple but is surprisingly tricky in execution. The effect of being mirrored accurately is not just feeling understood, but having the added sense of being in emotional attunement. Because these maneuvers are to be called upon during the heat of confrontation, when emotional arousal is sure to be high, they have to be overlearned if they're to be accessible when needed most. For these reasons, the above strategies need to be tried out and rehearsed during encounters that are not stressful if they are to have a chance to become an acquired first response. In essence, these antidotes to marital disintegration are a small remedial education in emotional intelligence. Milburn McBroom was a domineering boss with a temper that intimidated those who worked with him. That fact might have passed unremarked had McBroom worked in an office or factory, but McBroom was an airline pilot. One day in 1978, McBroom's plane was approaching Portland, Oregon, when he noticed a problem with the landing gear. So McBroom went into a holding pattern, circling the field at a high altitude while he fiddled with the mechanism. As McBroom obsessed about the landing gear, the plane's fuel gauges steadily approached the empty level. But his co-pilots were so fearful of McBroom's wrath that they said nothing, even as disaster loomed. The plane crashed, killing 10 people. Today, the story of that crash is told as a cautionary tale in the safety training of airline pilots. But the cockpit is a microcosm of any working organization. The cost-effectiveness of emotional intelligence is a relatively new idea for business, one some managers may find hard to accept. A study of 250 executives found that most felt their work demanded their heads but not their hearts. Many said they feared that feeling empathy or compassion for those they worked with would put them in conflict with their organizational goals. That study was done in the 1970s, when the business environment was very different. My argument is that such attitudes are outmoded, a luxury of a former day. A new competitive reality is putting emotional intelligence at a premium in the workplace and in the marketplace. As Shoshana Zuboff, a psychologist at Harvard Business School, pointed out to me, corporations have gone through a radical revolution within this century, and with this has come a corresponding transformation of the emotional landscape. There was a long period of managerial domination of the corporate hierarchy, when the manipulative jungle fighter boss was rewarded. But that rigid hierarchy started breaking down in the 1980s under the twin pressures of globalization and information technology. The jungle fighter symbolizes where the corporation has been. The virtuoso in interpersonal skills is the corporate future. Some of the reasons are patently obvious. Imagine the consequences for a working group when someone is unable to keep from exploding in anger or has no sensitivity about what the people around him are feeling. When emotionally upset, people can't remember, attend, learn, or make decisions clearly. As one management consultant put it, stress makes people stupid. Some of the less obvious reasons emotional aptitudes are moving to the forefront of business skills reflect sweeping changes in the workplace. Let me make my point by tracking the differences two applications of emotional intelligence make. One is in being able to air grievances as helpful critiques, the other in effective teamwork. Criticism is one of the most important tasks a manager has, yet too many managers have poorly mastered the crucial art of feedback. The emotional vicissitudes at work and marriage also operate in the workplace, where they take similar forms. Criticisms are voiced as personal attacks rather than complaints that can be acted upon. Many managers are too willing to criticize but frugal with praise, leaving their employees feeling that they only hear about how they're doing when they make a mistake. Consider the alternative. An artful critique can be one of the most helpful messages a manager can send. An artful critique focuses on what a person has done and can do, rather than reading a mark of character into a job poorly done. As one industrial psychologist observes, a character attack, calling someone stupid or incompetent, misses the point. You immediately put him on the defensive so that he's no longer receptive to what you have to tell him about how to do things better. That advice, of course, is precisely the same as for married couples airing their grievances. Harry Levinson, a psychoanalyst turned corporate consultant, gives the following advice on the art of the critique, which is intricately entwined with the art of praise. Be specific. Pick a significant incident, an event that illustrates a key problem that needs changing or a pattern of deficiency, such as the inability to do certain parts of a job well. Offer a solution. The critique, like all useful feedback, should point a way to fix the problem. Be present. Critiques, like praise, are most effective face-to-face and in private. Be sensitive. This is a call for empathy, for being attuned to the impact of what you say and how you say it on the person at the receiving end. By the end of the century, a third of the American workforce will be knowledge workers, people whose productivity is marked by adding value to information, whether as market analysts, writers, or computer programmers. Peter Drucker, the eminent business maven who coined the term knowledge worker, points out that such workers' expertise is highly specialized, and that their productivity depends on their efforts being coordinated as part of an organizational team. While people have always worked in tandem, notes Drucker, teams become the work unit rather than the individual himself. And that suggests why emotional intelligence, the skills that help people harmonize, should become increasingly valued as a workplace asset in the years to come. Electronic networks, email, teleconferences, work teams, informal networks, and the like are emerging as new functional entities in organizations. To the degree that the explicit hierarchy, as mapped on an organizational chart, is the skeleton of an organization, these human touch points are its central nervous system. Whenever people come together to collaborate, whether it be in an executive planning meeting or as a team working toward a shared product or decision, there's a very real sense in which they have a group IQ, the sum total of the talents and skills of all those involved. And how well they accomplish their task will be determined by how high that IQ is. The single most important element in group intelligence is not the average IQ in the academic sense, but rather in terms of emotional intelligence. The key to a high group IQ is social harmony. It's this ability to harmonize that, all other things being equal, will make one group especially talented, productive, and successful, and another, with members whose talent and skill are equal in other regards, do poorly. Consider, for example, a study of engineers, star performers at Bell Labs, the world-famous scientific think tank near Princeton. What makes the difference between stars and the others is not their academic IQ, but their emotional IQ. They're better able to motivate themselves and better able to work their informal networks into ad hoc teams. The stars were studied by Robert Kelly and Janet Kaplan, who wrote in the Harvard Business Review, "As it develops, academic talent was not a good predictor of on-the-job productivity, nor was IQ. The critical strategy the stars used to get the work done included a rapport with a network of key people." Informal networks are especially critical for handling unanticipated problems. The formal organization is set up to handle easily anticipated problems, one study of these networks observes. But when unexpected problems arise, the informal organization kicks in. Its complex web of social ties form every time colleagues communicate and solidify over time into surprisingly stable networks. As knowledge-based services and intellectual capital become more central to corporations, improving the way people work together will be a major way to leverage intellectual capital, making a critical competitive difference. To thrive, if not survive, corporations would do well to boost their collective emotional intelligence. A vague ache in my groin sent me to my doctor. Nothing seemed unusual until he looked at the results of a urine test. I had traces of blood in my urine. My doctor said, "I want you to go to the hospital and get some tests, kidney function and cytology." I don't know what he said next. My mind seemed to freeze at the word cytology. Cancer. I have a foggy memory of his explaining to me when and where to go for diagnostic tests. It was the simplest instruction, but I had to ask him to repeat it 3 or 4 times. Why should I have reacted so strongly? My doctor was just being thorough and competent, checking the limbs in a diagnostic decision tree. There was a tiny likelihood that cancer was the problem, But this rational analysis was irrelevant at that moment. In the land of the sick, emotions reign supreme. Fear is a thought away. The problem is when medical personnel ignore how patients are reacting emotionally, even while attending to their physical condition. This inattention to the emotional reality of illness neglects a growing body of evidence showing that people's emotional states can play a sometimes significant role in their vulnerability to disease and in the course of their recovery. Modern medical care too often lacks emotional intelligence. By now, a scientific case can be made that there's a margin of medical effectiveness, both in prevention and treatment, that can be gained by treating people's emotional state along with their medical condition. In 1974, a finding at the School of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Rochester rewrote biology's map of the body. Robert Ader, a psychologist, discovered that the immune system, like the brain, could learn. His result was a shock. The prevailing wisdom in medicine had been that only the brain and central nervous system could respond to experience by changing how they behaved. Ader's finding led to the investigation of what are turning out to be myriad ways the central nervous system and the immune system communicate. Biological pathways that make the mind, the emotions, and the body not separate, but intimately entwined. The immune system is the body's brain, as neuroscientist Francisco Varela puts it, defining the body's own sense of self, of what belongs within it and what does not. Immune cells travel in the bloodstream throughout the entire body, contacting virtually every other cell. Those cells they recognize, they leave alone. Those they fail to recognize, they attack. The attack either defends us against viruses, bacteria, and cancer, or, if the immune cells misidentify some of the body's own cells, creates an autoimmune disease such as allergy or lupus. A network of researchers is finding that the chemical messengers that operate most extensively in both brain and immune system are those that are most dense in neural areas that regulate emotion. One key pathway linking emotions in the immune system is via the influence of the hormones released under stress. Each has a strong impact on immune cells. While the relationships are complex, the main influence is that while these hormones surge through the body, the immune cells are hampered in their function. But if stress is constant and intense, that suppression may become long-lasting. Now scientists are finding more and more such connections between the brain and the cardiovascular and immune systems, having first had to accept the once radical notion that these connections exist at all. Now studies of links between emotions and health show that people who are chronically upset, constantly irritable or anxious, for example, have double the risk for getting a major disease. That makes constant emotional distress a greater health risk factor than smoking. Despite such evidence, many or most physicians are still skeptical that emotions matter clinically. One reason is that while many studies have found stress and negative emotions to weaken the effectiveness of various immune cells, it's not always clear that the range of these changes is great enough to make a medical difference. Taking a more detailed look at the data for specific emotions, especially the big three, anger, anxiety, and depression, makes clearer some specific ways that feelings have medical significance, even if the biological mechanisms by which such emotions have their effect are yet to be fully understood. There's evidence emerging from dozens of studies pointing to the power of anger to damage the heart. The old idea has not held up that a hurried, high-pressure type A personality is at great risk from heart disease, but from that failed theory has emerged a new finding. It's hostility that puts people at risk. Much of the data on hostility has come from research by Dr. Redford Williams at Duke University. For example, Williams found that those physicians who had the highest scores on a test of hostility while still in medical school were 7 times as likely to have died by the age of 50 as were those with low hostility scores. Being prone to anger was a stronger predictor of dying young than were other risk factors such as smoking, high blood pressure, even high cholesterol. Once heart disease develops, the mechanisms triggered by anger affect the very efficiency of the heart as a pump. This makes anger particularly lethal in those who already have heart disease. The strongest scientific links between emotions and heart disease are to anger. A Harvard Medical School study asked more than 1,500 men and women who had suffered heart attacks to describe their emotional state in the hours before the attack. Being angry more than doubled the risk of cardiac arrest in people who already had heart disease. The heightened risk lasted for about 2 hours after the anger was aroused. The hopeful news is that chronic anger need not be a death sentence. Hostility is a habit that can change. As Williams told me, the antidote to hostility is to develop a more trusting heart. All it takes is the right motivation. When people see that their hostility can lead to an early grave, they're ready to try. Anxiety, the distress evoked by life's pressures, is perhaps the emotion with the greatest weight of scientific evidence connecting it to the onset of sickness and the course of recovery. When anxiety helps us prepare to deal with some danger, a presumed utility in evolution, then it serves us well. But in modern life, anxiety is more often out of proportion and out of place. Distress comes in the face of situations that we must live with or that are conjured by the mind, not real dangers we need to confront. Repeated bouts of anxiety signal high levels of stress. Particularly compelling evidence for the medical impact from distress has come from studies with infectious diseases such as colds, the flu, and herpes. We're continually exposed to such viruses, but ordinarily our immune system fights them off, except that under emotional stress, those defenses more often fail. The toll of anxiety is not just that it lowers the immune response. Other research is showing adverse effects on the cardiovascular system. While chronic hostility and repeated episodes of anger seem to put men at greatest risk for heart disease, the more deadly emotions in women may be anxiety and fear. Understandably, health risks seem greatest for those whose jobs are high in strain. In a study of 569 patients with colorectal cancer and a matched comparison group, those who said that in the previous 10 years they had experienced severe on-the-job aggravation were 5.5 times more likely to have developed the cancer compared to those with no such stress in their lives. Because the medical toll of distress is so broad, relaxation techniques, which directly counter the physiological arousal of stress, are being used clinically to ease the symptoms of a wide variety of chronic illnesses. Evidence is mounting that for patients with serious disease who are depressed, it would pay medically to treat their depression too. One complication in treating depression in medical patients is that its symptoms, including loss of appetite and lethargy, are easily mistaken for signs of other diseases, particularly by physicians with little training in psychiatric diagnosis. The failure to diagnose and treat may add to the risk of death in severe disease. For instance, of 100 patients who received bone marrow transplants, 12 of 13 who had been depressed died within the first year of the transplant, while 34 of the remaining 87 were still alive 2 years later. The cumulative evidence for adverse medical effects from anger, anxiety, and depression, then, is compelling. But if chronic emotional distress in its many forms is toxic, the opposite range of emotion can be tonic, to a degree. This by no means says that positive emotion is curative or that laughter or happiness alone will turn the course of a serious disease. But like its near cousin, optimism, hope has healing power. People who have a great deal of hopefulness are understandably better able to bear up under trying circumstances, including medical difficulties. Also, the quality of relationships, as well as their sheer number, seems key to buffering stress. Negative relationships take their own toll. Marital arguments, for example, have a negative impact on the immune system. Ohio State University psychologist John Cacioppo told me it's the most important relationships in your life, the people you see day in and day out, that seem to be crucial for your health. And the more significant the relationship is in your life, the more it matters for your health. Perhaps the most powerful demonstration of the clinical power of emotional support was in groups at Stanford University Medical School for women with advanced metastatic breast cancer. After an initial treatment, often including surgery, these women's cancer had returned and was spreading through their bodies. It was only a matter of time, clinically speaking, until the spreading cancer killed them. Dr. David Spiegel, who conducted the study, was himself stunned by the findings, as was the medical community. Women with advanced breast cancer who went to weekly meetings with others survived twice as long as did women with the same disease who faced it on their own. There are many ways medicine can expand its view of health to include the emotional realities of illness. For one, patients could routinely be offered fuller information essential to the decisions they must make about their own medical care. Moments when patients face surgery or invasive and painful tests are fraught with anxiety and are a prime opportunity to deal with the emotional dimension. Some hospitals have developed pre-surgery instructions for patients that help them assuage their fears, for example, by teaching patients relaxation techniques, answering their questions well in advance of surgery, and telling them several days ahead of surgery precisely what they're likely to experience during their recovery. The result? Patients recover from surgery an average of 2 or 3 days sooner. There's the added medical value of an empathic physician or nurse attuned to patients, able to listen and be heard. This means recognizing that the relationship between physician and patient is itself a factor of significance. Such steps are a beginning, but for medicine to enlarge its vision to embrace the impact of emotions, 2 large implications of the scientific findings must be taken to heart. For one, helping people better manage their upsetting feelings is a form of disease prevention. One way to do this that could have broad public health effects would be to impart the most basic emotional intelligence skills to children so that they become lifelong habits. Another high-payoff preventive strategy would be to teach emotion management to people reaching retirement age, since emotional well-being is one factor that determines whether an older person declines rapidly or thrives. A third target group might be so-called at-risk populations, the very poor, single working mothers, residents of high-crime neighborhoods, and the like, who live under extraordinary pressure day in and day out, and so might do better medically with help in handling the emotional toll of these stresses. Many patients can benefit measurably when their psychological needs are attended to along with their purely medical ones. There may be a business advantage to humane medicine. Treating emotional distress in patients, early evidence suggests, can save money, especially to the extent that it prevents or delays the onset of sickness or helps patients heal more quickly. Finally, medical ethics may demand such an approach. An editorial in the Journal of the American Medical Association commented, "The clear demonstration that psychological factors like depression and social isolation distinguish the coronary heart disease patients at highest risk means it would be unethical not to start trying to treat these factors." It's time for medicine to take more methodical advantage of the link between emotion and health. What's now the exception could and should be part of the mainstream, so that a more caring medicine is available to us all. At the least, it would make medicine more humane, and for some it could speed the course of recovery. Compassion, as one patient put it in an open letter to his surgeon, is not mere hand-holding. It's good medicine. The impact of parenting on emotional competence starts in the cradle. Dr. T. Barry Brazelton, the eminent Harvard pediatrician, has a simple diagnostic test of a baby's basic outlook toward life. He offers 2 blocks to an 8-month-old and then shows the baby how he wants her to put the 2 blocks together. A baby who's hopeful about life, who has confidence in her own abilities, says Brazelton, will pick up 1 block, mouth it, rub it in her hair, drop it over the side of the table, watching to see whether you'll retrieve it for her. When you do, she finally completes the requested task. Place the 2 blocks together. Then she looks up at you with a bright-eyed look of expectancy that says, "Tell me how great I am." Babies like these have gotten a goodly dose of approval and encouragement from the adults in their lives. They expect to succeed in life's little challenges. By contrast, babies who come from homes too bleak, chaotic, or neglectful go about the same small task in a way that signals they already expect to fail. It's not that these babies fail to bring the blocks together. They understand the instruction and have the coordination to comply, but even when they do, reports Brazelton, their demeanor is hangdog, a look that says, "I'm no good, see I failed." Such children, says Brazelton, are likely to go through life with a defeatist outlook, expecting no encouragement or interest from teachers, finding school joyless, perhaps eventually dropping out. The first opportunity for shaping the ingredients of emotional intelligence is in the earliest years, though these capacities continue to form throughout the school years and into adolescence. A child's readiness for school depends on the most basic of all knowledge, how to learn. One report lists the 7 key ingredients of this crucial capacity, all related to emotional intelligence. 1. Confidence. The child sensed that he is more likely than not to succeed at what he undertakes and that adults will be helpful. 2. Curiosity, the sense that finding out about things is positive and leads to pleasure. 3. Intentionality, the wish and capacity to have an impact and to act upon that with persistence. 4. Self-control, the ability to modulate and control one's own actions in age-appropriate ways. 5. Relatedness, the ability to engage with others based on the sense of being understood by and understanding others. 6. The capacity to communicate. And 7. Cooperativeness. Whether or not a child arrives at school on the first day of kindergarten with these capabilities depends greatly on how much her parents and preschool teachers have given her the kind of care that amounts to a Heart Start, the emotional equivalent of the Head Start programs. Emotional learning begins in life's earliest moments and continues throughout childhood. All the small exchanges between parent and child have an emotional subtext, and in the repetition of these messages over the years, children form the core of their emotional outlook and capabilities. A little girl who finds a puzzle frustrating and asks her busy mother to help gets one message if the reply is the mother's clear pleasure at the request, quite another if it's a curt, "Don't bother me, I've got important work to do." When such encounters become typical of child and parent, they mold the child's emotional expectations about relationships, outlooks that will flavor her functioning in all realms of life for better or worse. The risks are greatest for those children whose parents are grossly inept, immature, abusing drugs, depressed or chronically angry, or simply aimless in living chaotic lives. Simple neglect, studies find, can be more damaging than outright abuse. A survey of maltreated children found the neglected youngsters doing the worst of all. They were the most anxious, inattentive, and apathetic, alternately aggressive and withdrawn. The rate for having to repeat first grade among them was 65%. The first 3 or 4 years of life are a period when the toddler's brain grows to about 2/3 its full size, and it evolves in complexity at a greater rate than it ever will again. During this period, key kinds of learning take place more readily than later in life, emotional learning foremost among them. During this time, severe stress can impair the brain's learning centers and so be damaging to the intellect. Though, as we shall see, this can be remedied to some extent by experiences later in life, the impact of this early learning is profound. As one report sums up the key emotional lessons of life's first 4 years, the lasting consequences are great. A child who cannot focus his attention, who is suspicious rather than trusting, sad or angry rather than optimistic, destructive rather than respectful, and one who is overcome with anxiety, preoccupied with frightening fantasy, and feels generally unhappy about himself, such a child has little opportunity at all, let alone equal opportunity, to claim the possibilities of the world as his own. In the rough-and-tumble play of the daycare center, Martin, just 2 1/2, brushed up against a little girl who inexplicably broke out crying. Martin reached for her hand, but as the sobbing girl moved away, Martin slapped her on the arm. As her tears continued, Martin looked away and yelled, "Cut it out!" over and over, each time faster and louder. When Martin then made another attempt to pat her, again she resisted. This time Martin bared his teeth like a snarling dog, hissing at the sobbing girl. Once more Martin started patting the crying girl, but the pats on the back quickly turned into pounding, and Martin went on hitting and hitting the poor little girl, despite her screams. That disturbing encounter testifies to how abuse, being beaten repeatedly at the whim of a parent's moods, warps a child's natural bent toward empathy. Martin's violent response to distress may well mirror the lessons he learned at home about tears and anguish. For abused children, crying is met at first with a peremptory, consoling gesture, but if it continues, the progression is from nasty looks and shouts to hitting to outright beating. Perhaps most troubling, Martin already seems to lack the most primitive sort of empathy. At 2 1/2, he displays the budding moral impulses of a cruel and sadistic brute. The callousness of abused children is simply a more extreme version of that seen in children whose parents are critical, threatening, and overly harsh in their punishments. What's perhaps most troubling about the abused toddlers is how early they seem to have learned to respond like miniature versions of their own abusive parents. Perhaps the most instructive paradigm for understanding the emotional learning abused children have undergone is in seeing how trauma can leave a lasting imprint on the brain, and how even these savage imprints can be mended. Victims of a devastating trauma may never be the same biologically, Dr. Dennis Charney, a Yale psychiatrist, told me. He adds, "It doesn't matter if it was the incessant terror of combat, torture, or repeated abuse in childhood, or a one-time experience like being trapped in a hurricane or nearly dying in an auto accident. All uncontrollable stress can have the same biological impact." The operative word is uncontrollable. If people feel there's something they can do in a catastrophic situation, some control they can exert, no matter how minor, they fare far better emotionally than do those who feel utterly helpless. The helpless person is the one more susceptible to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, afterward. It's the feeling that your life is in danger and there's nothing you can do to escape it. That's the moment a brain change begins. It had been months since a huge earthquake shook her out of bed and sent her yelling in panic through the darkened house to find her 4-year-old son. They huddled for hours in the Los Angeles night cold under a protective doorway, pinned there without food, water, or light, while wave after wave of aftershocks tumbled the ground beneath them. Now, months later, she had largely recovered from the ready panic that gripped her for the first few days afterward, when a door slamming could start her shivering with fear. The one lingering symptom was her inability to sleep, a problem that struck only on those nights her husband was away, as he had been the night of the quake. The main symptoms of such learned fearfulness, including the most intense kind, PTSD, can be accounted for by changes in the limbic circuitry focusing on the amygdala. There, neurochemicals mobilize the body for an emergency and stamp memories with special strength. In PTSD, the system becomes hyperreactive, secreting extra-large doses of these brain chemicals in response to situations that hold little or no threat, but somehow are reminders of the original trauma. Such traumatic memories seem to remain as fixtures in brain functioning because they interfere with subsequent learning, specifically with relearning a more normal response to those traumatizing moments. In acquired fear such as PTSD, the mechanisms of learning and memory have gone awry. Again, it's the amygdala that's key among the brain regions involved. But in overcoming the learned fear, the neocortex is critical. But given the right experiences, even PTSD can lift. Strong emotional memories and the patterns of thought and reaction that they trigger can change with time. This relearning, Charney proposes, is cortical. The original fear ingrained in the amygdala doesn't go away completely. Rather, the prefrontal cortex actively suppresses the amygdala's command to the rest of the brain to respond with fear. Irene had gone on a date that ended in attempted rape. Though she had fought off the attacker, he continued to plague her, harassing her with obscene phone calls, making threats of violence, calling in the middle of the night, stalking her and watching her every move. Once when she tried to get the police to help, they dismissed her problem as trivial, since nothing, as they said, had really happened. By the time she came for therapy, Irene had symptoms of PTSD, had given up socializing at all, and felt a prisoner in her own house. Irene's case is cited by Dr. Judith Lewis Herman, a Harvard psychiatrist whose groundbreaking work outlines the steps to recovery from trauma. Herman sees 3 stages: attaining a sense of safety, remembering the details of the trauma, and mourning the loss it's brought, finally reestablishing a normal life. There's a biological logic to the ordering of these steps, as we shall see. This sequence seems to reflect how the emotional brain learns once again that life need not be regarded as an emergency about to happen. The first step, regaining a sense of safety, presumably translates to finding ways to calm the too easily triggered emotional circuits enough to allow relearning. Often this begins with helping patients understand that their jumpiness and nightmares, hypervigilance and panics are part of the symptoms of PTSD. This understanding makes the symptoms themselves less frightening. Another early step is to help patients regain some sense of control over what's happening to them. Irene, for example, mobilized her friends and family to form a buffer between her and her stalker and was able to get the police to intervene. The sense in which PTSD patients feel unsafe goes beyond fears that dangers lurk around them. Their insecurity begins more intimately in the feeling that they have no control over what's happening in their body and to their emotions. This is understandable given the hair trigger for emotional hijacking that PTSD creates by hypersensitizing the amygdala circuitry. Medication offers one way to restore patients' sense that they need not be so at the mercy of the emotional alarms that flood them with inexplicable anxiety, keep them sleepless, or pepper their sleep with nightmares. Patients also may learn relaxation techniques that give them the ability to counter their edginess and nervousness. A physiological calm opens a window for helping the brutalized emotional circuitry rediscover that life is not a threat, and for giving back to patients some of the sense of security they had in their lives before the trauma happened. Another step in healing involves retelling and reconstructing the story of the trauma in safety. The therapist encourages the patient to retell the traumatic events as vividly as possible, like a horror home video, retrieving every sordid detail. This includes not just the specifics of what they saw, heard, smelled, and felt, but also their reactions, the dread, disgust, nausea. By putting sensory details and feelings into words, presumably memories are brought more under control of the neocortex, where the reactions they kindle can be rendered more understandable and so more manageable. The mourning that ensues while retelling such painful events serves a crucial purpose. It marks the ability to let go of the trauma itself to some degree. It means that instead of being perpetually captured by this moment in the past, patients can start to look ahead, even to hope, and to rebuild a new life, free from the trauma's grip. If PTSD can be healed, so can the more muted emotional scars that so many of us bear. That's the task of psychotherapy. And in general, it's in learning to deal skillfully with these loaded reactions that emotional intelligence comes into play. As Joseph Ledoux, the neuroscientist who discovered the amygdala's hair trigger role in emotional outbursts, conjectures, once your emotional system learns something, it seems you never let it go. What therapy does is teach you to control it. It teaches your neocortex how to inhibit your amygdala. The propensity to act is suppressed, while your basic emotion about it remains in a subdued form. Over the course of therapy, what seems to change in the main are the responses that people make once an emotional reaction is triggered. But the tendency for the reaction to be triggered in the first place doesn't disappear entirely. In short, emotional lessons, even the most deeply implanted habits of the heart learned in childhood, can be reshaped. Emotional learning is lifelong. So much for altering emotional patterns that have been learned, but what about those responses that are givens of our genetic endowment? What of changing the habitual reactions of people who by nature are, say, highly volatile or painfully shy? This range of the emotional compass falls under the sweep of temperament, the background murmur of feelings that mark our basic disposition. Every parent has seen this. From birth, a child will be calm and placid or testy and difficult. The question is whether such a biologically determined emotional set can be changed by experience. Does our biology fix our emotional destiny, or can even an innately shy child grow into a more confident adult? The clearest answer to this question comes from the work of Jerome Kagan, the eminent developmental psychologist at Harvard University. Kagan posits that there are at least 4 temperamental types: timid, bold, upbeat, and melancholy, and that each is due to a different pattern of brain activity. Kagan's work concentrates on one of these patterns, the dimension of temperament that runs from boldness to timidity. Kagan finds that children who are overly sensitive and fearful grow into shy and timorous adults. From birth, about 15 to 20% of children are what he calls behaviorally inhibited. As infants, these children are timid about anything unfamiliar. As adults, they're prone to be wallflowers and morbidly afraid of having to give a speech or perform in public. The encouraging news from Kagan's studies is that not all fearful infants grow up hanging back from life. Temperament is not destiny. The overexcitable amygdala can be tamed with the right experiences. What makes the difference are the emotional lessons and responses children learn as they grow. For the timid child, what matters at the outset is how they're treated by their parents, and so how they learn to handle their natural timidness. Those parents who engineer gradual emboldening experiences for their children offer them what may be a lifelong corrective to their fearfulness. Kagan told me those children who had become less timid by kindergarten seemed to have had parents who put gentle pressure on them to be more outgoing. Although this temperamental trait seems slightly harder than others to change, probably because of its physiological basis, no human quality is beyond change. Throughout childhood, some timid children grow bolder as experience continues to mold the key neural circuitry. These advances toward boldness are very encouraging. They suggest that even innate emotional patterns can change to some degree. Our emotional capacities are not a given. With the right learning, they can be improved. The reasons for this lie in how the human brain matures. Of all species, we humans take the longest for our brains to fully mature. While each area of the brain develops at a different rate during childhood, the onset of puberty marks one of the most sweeping periods of pruning throughout the brain. Several brain areas critical for emotional life are among the slowest to mature. While the sensory areas mature during childhood and the limbic system by puberty, the frontal lobes, seat of emotional self-control, understanding, and artful response, continue to develop into late adolescence, somewhere between 16 and 18 years of age. It stands to reason that the key skills of emotional intelligence each have critical periods extending over several years in childhood. Each period represents a window for helping that child instill beneficial emotional habits, or, if missed, to make it that much harder to offer corrective lessons later in life. To be sure, the brain remains plastic throughout life, though not to the spectacular extent seen in childhood. All learning implies a change in the brain, a strengthening of synaptic connection. Emotional habits are malleable throughout life, with some sustained effort, even at the neural level. Some of the most telling of such lessons come from parent to child. There are very different emotional habits instilled by parents whose attunement means an infant's emotional needs are acknowledged and met on one hand, or self-absorbed parents who ignore a child's distress. Much psychotherapy is, in a sense, a remedial tutorial for what was skewed or missed completely earlier in life. But why not do what we can to prevent that need by giving children the nurturing and guidance that cultivates the essential emotional skills in the first place? It began as a small dispute, but it escalated. Ian Moore, a senior at Thomas Jefferson High School in Brooklyn, and Tyrone Sinclair, a junior, had had a falling out with a buddy, 15-year-old Khalil Sumter. Then they started picking on him and making threats. Now it exploded. Khalil, scared that Ian and Tyrone were going to beat him up, brought a .38 caliber pistol to school one morning and 15 feet from a school guard, shot both boys to death at point-blank range in the school's hallway. The incident, chilling as it is, can be read as yet another sign of a desperate need for lessons in handling emotions, settling disagreements peaceably, and just plain getting along. Educators, long disturbed by school children's lagging scores in math and reading, are realizing there's a different and more alarming deficiency, emotional illiteracy. And while laudable efforts are being made to raise academic standards, this new and troubling deficiency is not being addressed in the standard school curriculum. As one Brooklyn teacher put it, the present emphasis in school suggests that we care more about how well school children can read and write than whether they'll be alive next week. Unless things change, the long-term prospects for today's children marrying and having a fruitful, stable life together are growing more dismal with each generation. Data comparing the emotional condition of American children in the mid-1970s and at the end of the 1980s showed that they were doing more poorly in these specific ways: more withdrawn or social problems, more anxious and depressed, more impulsive, more acting before thinking, more delinquent, more aggressive. While any of these problems in isolation raises no eyebrows, taken as a group, they're barometers of a new kind of toxicity seeping into and poisoning the very experience of childhood, signifying sweeping deficits in emotional competencies. This emotional malaise seems to be a universal price of modern life for children. No children, rich or poor, are exempt from risk. These problems are universal, occurring in all ethnic, racial, and income groups. And this is not just an American phenomenon, but a global one. If families no longer function effectively to put all our children on a firm footing for life, what are we to do? A more careful look at the mechanics of specific problems suggests how given deficits in emotional or social competence lay the foundation for grave problems, and how well-aimed correctives or preventives could keep more children on track. In my elementary school, the tough kid was Jimmy. He was the kid who would steal your lunch money, take your bike, slug you as soon as talk to you. Jimmy was a classic bully, starting fights with the least provocation or none at all. The lifelong legacy of childhood aggressiveness in kids like Jimmy has emerged from many studies. As we've seen, the family life of such aggressive children typically includes parents who alternate neglect with harsh and capricious punishments, a pattern that, perhaps understandably, makes the children a bit paranoid or combative. Another trait of such children is that once they're in the heat of anger, they can think of only one way to react, by lashing out. This testifies to a deep perceptual bias in people who are unusually aggressive. They act on the basis of the assumption of hostility or threat, paying too little attention to what is actually going on. Once they assume threat, they leapfrog to action. These perceptual biases toward hostility are already in place by the early grades. While most children, and especially boys, are rambunctious in kindergarten and first grade, the more aggressive children fail to learn a modicum of self-control by second grade. Of all children, these are the ones most at risk for eventually committing violent crimes. The drift toward crime shows up surprisingly early in these children's lives. By fourth or fifth grade, these kids are rejected by their peers and are unable to make friends easily. They've become academic failures. Feeling themselves friendless, they gravitate to other social outcasts. In the high school years, this outcast group typically drops out of school and drift toward delinquency, engaging in petty crimes such as shoplifting, theft, and drug dealing. But timely help can change these attitudes and stop a child's trajectory toward delinquency. Several experimental programs have had some success in helping such aggressive kids learn to control their antisocial bent before it leads to more serious trouble. One at Duke University worked with anger-ridden grade school troublemakers in training sessions for 40 minutes twice a week for 6 to 12 weeks. The boys were taught, for example, to see how some of the social cues they interpreted as hostile were in fact neutral or friendly. One of the key skills for anger control was monitoring their feelings, becoming aware of their body's sensations such as flushing or muscle tensing as they were getting angry, and to take those feelings as a cue to stop and consider what to do next rather than strike out impulsively. Particularly in young people, problems in relationships are a trigger for depression. The difficulty is as often in children's relationships with their parents as it is with their peers. Depressed children and teenagers are frequently unable or unwilling to talk about their sadness. They seem unable to label their feelings accurately, showing instead a sullen irritability, impatience, crankiness, and anger, especially toward their parents. A new look at the causes of depression in the young pinpoints deficits in two areas of emotional competence: relationship skills on the one hand, and a depression-promoting way of interpreting setbacks on the other. While some of the tendency to depression almost certainly is due to genetic destiny, some of that tendency seems due to reversible pessimistic habits of thought that predispose children to react to life's small defeats by becoming depressed. And there's evidence to suggest that the predisposition to depression, whatever its basis, is becoming ever more widespread among the young. These millennial years are ushering in an age of melancholy, just as the 20th century became an age of anxiety. International data show what seems to be a modern epidemic of depression, one that's spreading side by side with the adoption throughout the world of modern ways. Each successive generation worldwide since the opening of the century has lived with a higher risk than their parents of suffering a major depression. Not just sadness, but a paralyzing listlessness, dejection and self-pity, and an overwhelming hopelessness over the course of life. And those episodes are beginning at earlier and earlier ages. Childhood depression is emerging as a fixture of the modern scene. Dr. David Kupfer, chairman of psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh Medical School, points to a trend. With the spread of industrialization after World War II, in a sense nobody was home anymore. In more and more families, there's been growing parental indifference to children's needs as they grow up. This is not a direct cause of depression, but it sets up a vulnerability. Early emotional stressors may affect neuron development, which can lead to a depression when you're under great stress, even decades later. That depression should not just be treated but prevented in children is clear from an alarming discovery. Even mild episodes of depression in a child can augur more severe episodes later in life. This challenges the old assumption that depression in children doesn't matter in the long run, since, as some people claim, children might grow out of it. The sullenness children feel leads them to avoid initiating social contacts or to look away when another child is trying to engage them, a social signal the other child only takes as a rebuff. The end result is that depressed children end up rejected or neglected on the playground. Just as with adults, pessimistic ways of interpreting life's defeat seem to feed the sense of helplessness and hopelessness at the heart of children's depression. What has only emerged recently, though, is that children who are most prone to melancholy tend toward this pessimistic outlook before they become depressed. This insight suggests a window of opportunity for inoculating them against depression before it strikes. The good news? There's every sign that teaching children more productive ways of looking at their difficulties lowers their risk of depression. In a study of one Oregon high school, about 1 in 4 students had what psychologists call a low-level depression, not severe enough to say it was beyond ordinary unhappiness as yet. Some may have been in the early weeks or months of what was to become a more severe depression. In a special after-school class, 75 of the mildly depressed students learned to challenge the thinking patterns associated with depression, to become more adept at making friends, to get along better with their parents, and to engage in more social activities they found pleasant. By the end of the 8-week program, 55% of the students had recovered from their mild depression, while only about a quarter of equally depressed students who were not in the program had begun to pull out of the depression. A year later, a quarter of those in the comparison group had gone on to fall into a major depression, as opposed to only 14% of students in the depression prevention program. Though they lasted just 8 sessions, the classes seemed to have cut the risk of depression in half. Other experts on childhood depression applaud the new programs. If you want to make a real difference for psychiatric illness like depression, you have to do something before the kids get sick in the first place, commented Maria Kovacs, a psychologist in Pittsburgh. The real solution is a psychological inoculation. During my days as a graduate student in clinical psychology in the late 1960s, I knew 2 women who suffered from eating disorders. One was a mathematician who today would be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa. The other, a librarian, would be diagnosed with bulimia. In those years, there were no such labels. When a study was done with more than 900 girls in the 7th through 10th grades, emotional deficits, particularly a failure to tell distressing feelings from one another and from hunger, and to control them, were found to be key among the factors leading to eating disorders. Even by 10th grade, there were 61 girls in this affluent suburban Minneapolis high school who already had serious symptoms of anorexia or bulimia. The greater the problem, the more the girls reacted to setbacks, difficulties, and minor annoyances with intense negative feelings that they could not soothe, and the less their awareness of what exactly they were feeling. When these 2 emotional tendencies were coupled with being highly dissatisfied with their body, then the outcome was anorexia or bulimia. Overly controlling parents were found not to play a prime role in causing eating disorders. Also judged irrelevant were such popular explanations as fear of sexuality, early onset of puberty, and low self-esteem. Instead, the causal chain this prospective study revealed began with the effects on young girls of growing up in a society preoccupied with unnatural thinness as a sign of female beauty. Well in advance of adolescence, girls are already self-conscious about their weight. But the Minneapolis study showed that an obsession with being overweight is not in and of itself sufficient to explain why some girls go on to develop eating disorders. Some obese people are unable to tell the difference between being scared, angry, and hungry, and so lump all those feelings together as signifying hunger, which leads them to overeat whenever they feel upset. Something similar seems to be happening in these girls. The combination of poor inner awareness and weak social skills means that these girls, when upset by friends or parents, fail to act effectively to soothe either the relationship or their own distress. Instead, their upset triggers the eating disorder. Psychologist Gloria Leone believes effective treatments for such girls need to include some remedial instruction in the emotional skills they lack. She told me, clinicians find that if you address the deficits, therapy works better. Dropping out of school is a particular risk for children who are social rejects. The dropout rate for children who are rejected by their peers is between 2 and 8 times greater than for children who have friends. Two kinds of emotional proclivities lead children to end up as social outcasts. One is the propensity to angry outbursts and to perceive hostility even where none is intended. The second is being timid, anxious, and socially shy. But over and above these temperamental factors, it's children who are off, whose awkwardness repeatedly makes people uncomfortable, who tend to be shunted aside. One way these children are off is in the emotional signals they send. They're not seen as fun to be with, and they don't know how to make another child feel good. Children who are socially rejected are only half as likely as their peers to have a best friend during the crucial years of elementary school, and so they miss out on one of the most essential chances for emotional growth. One friend can make the difference, even when all others turn their backs, and even when that friendship is not all that solid. There's hope for rejected children despite their ineptness. Stephen Asher, a University of Illinois psychologist, has designed a series of friendship coaching sessions for unpopular children that has shown some success. Identifying 3rd and 4th graders who are the least liked in their classes, Asher gave them 6 sessions on how to make playing games more fun through being friendly, fun, and nice. To avoid stigma, the children were told they were acting as consultants to the coach, who was trying to learn what kinds of things make it more enjoyable to play games. The children were coached to act in ways Asher had found typical of more popular children. For example, they were encouraged to think of alternative suggestions and compromises rather than fighting if they disagree about the rules, to remember to talk with and ask questions about the other child while they play, to listen and look at the other child to see how he's doing, to say something nice when the other person does well, to smile and offer help or suggestions and encouragement. This mini-course in getting along had a remarkable effect. A year later, the children who were coached were now solidly in the middle of classroom popularity. None were social stars, but none were rejects. While in the United States, use of most drugs among young people generally tapered off in the 1980s, there's a steady trend toward more alcohol use at ever younger ages. For most alcoholics and drug abusers, the beginnings of addiction can be traced to their teen years, though few of those who so experiment end up as alcoholics or drug abusers. By the time students leave high school, over 90% have tried alcohol, yet only about 14% eventually become alcoholics. Of the millions of Americans who experimented with cocaine, fewer than 5% became addicted. Certain emotional patterns seem to make people more likely to find emotional relief in one substance rather than another. For example, there are 2 emotional pathways to alcoholism. One starts with someone who was high-strung and anxious in childhood, who typically discovers as a teenager that alcohol will calm the anxiety. A second emotional pathway to alcoholism comes from a high level of agitation, impulsivity, and boredom. This pattern shows up in infancy as being restless, cranky, and hard to handle, in grade school as having the fidgets, hyperactivity, and getting into trouble. While depression can drive some to drink, the metabolic effects of alcohol often simply worsen the depression after a short lift. People who turn to alcohol as an emotional palliative do so much more often to calm anxiety than for depression. Though the predisposition to substance abuse may in many cases be brain-based, the feelings that drive people to self-medicate themselves through drink or drugs can be handled without recourse to medication, as Alcoholics Anonymous and other recovery programs have demonstrated for decades. Acquiring the ability to handle those feelings, soothing anxiety, lifting depression, calming rage, removes the impetus to use drugs or alcohol in the first place. These basic emotional skills are taught remedially in treatment programs for drug and alcohol abuse. It would be far better, of course, if they were learned early in life, well before the habit became established. To be sure, not every mental disorder can be prevented, but there are some and perhaps many that can. Sociologist Ronald Kessler told me, "We need to intervene early in life. Take a young girl who has a social phobia in the 6th grade and starts drinking in junior high school to handle her social anxieties. By her late 20s, when she shows up in our study, she's still fearful, has become both an alcohol and drug abuser, and is depressed because her life is so messed up. The big question is, what could we have done early in her life to have headed off the whole downward spiral? The same holds true, of course, for dropping out or violence or most of the litany of perils faced by young people today. An instructive case in point is sexual abuse of children. As of 1993, about 200,000 substantiated cases were reported annually in the United States, with that number growing by almost 10% per year. With these risks in mind, many schools have begun to offer programs to prevent sexual abuse. Most such programs are tightly focused on basic information about sexual abuse, teaching kids, for example, to know the difference between good and bad touching, alerting them to the dangers, and encouraging them to tell an adult if anything untoward happens to them. But a national survey of 2,000 children found that this basic training was little better than nothing in helping children do something to prevent being victimized, whether by a school bully or a potential child molester. By contrast, children given more comprehensive training, including related emotional and social competencies, were better able to protect themselves against the threat of being victimized. They were far more likely to demand to be left alone, to yell or fight back, to threaten to tell, and to actually tell if something bad did happen to them. Such findings have led to a re-envisioning of what the ingredients of an optimal prevention program should be, based on those that impartial evaluations showed to be truly effective. In a 5-year project sponsored by the W.T. Grant Foundation, a consortium of researchers studied this landscape and distilled the active ingredients that seemed crucial to the success of those programs that worked. The list of key skills the consortium concluded should be covered, no matter what specific problem it's designed to prevent, reads like the ingredients of emotional intelligence. The emotional skills include self-awareness, identifying, expressing, and managing feelings, impulse control and delaying gratification, and handling stress and anxiety. A key ability in impulse control is knowing the difference between feelings and actions and learning to make better emotional decisions by first controlling the impulse to act, then identifying alternative actions and their consequences before acting. Many competencies are interpersonal: reading social and emotional cues, listening, being able to resist negative influences, taking others' perspectives, and understanding what behavior is acceptable in a situation. No single kind of intervention, including one targeting emotions, can claim to do the whole job, but to the degree emotional deficits add to a child's risk, attention must be paid to emotional remedies, not to the exclusion of other answers, but along with them. The next question is, what would an education in the emotions look like? It's a strange roll call going around the circle of 15 fifth graders sitting Indian style on the floor. As a teacher calls their names, the students respond not with a vacant "here," standard in schools, but instead call out a number that indicates how they feel. 1 means low spirits, 10, high energy. Today spirits are high. Jessica? 10, I'm jazzed, it's Friday. Patrick? 9, excited, a little nervous. Nicole? 10, peaceful, happy. It's a class in self-science at the Nueva Learning Center near San Francisco, a private school that offers what may be a model course in emotional intelligence. The subject in self-science is feelings, your own and those that erupt in relationships. The topic, by its very nature, demands that teachers and students focus on the emotional fabric of a child's life, a focus that's determinedly ignored in almost every other classroom in America. The strategy here includes using the tensions and traumas of children's lives as the topic of the day. Teachers speak to real issues: hurt over being left out, envy, disagreements that could escalate into a schoolyard battle. As Karen Stone McCown, developer of the self-science curriculum and director of Nueva, put it, learning doesn't take place in isolation from kids' feelings. Being emotionally literate is as important for learning as instruction in math or reading. Self-science is a pioneer and early harbinger of an idea that's spreading to schools coast to coast. Names for these classes range from social development to life skills to social and emotional learning. Some, referring to Howard Gardner's idea of multiple intelligences, use the term personal intelligences. The common thread is the goal of raising the level of social and emotional competence in children as a part of their regular education, not just something taught remedially to children who are faltering and identified as troubled, but a set of skills and understandings essential for every child. Interventions designed to target specific deficits in emotional and social skills can be highly effective as buffers for children. But those well-designed interventions, in the main, have been run by research psychologists as experiments. The next step is to take the lessons learned from such highly focused programs and generalize them as a preventive measure for the entire school population, taught by ordinary teachers. This new departure in bringing emotional literacy into schools makes emotions and social life themselves topics rather than treating those most compelling facets of a child's day as irrelevant intrusions, or, when they lead to eruptions, relegating them to occasional disciplinary trips to the principal's office. The classes themselves may at first glance seem uneventful, much less a solution to the dramatic problems they address. But that's largely because, like good child-rearing at home, the lessons imparted are small but telling, delivered regularly and over a sustained period of years. That's how emotional learning becomes ingrained. As experiences are repeated over and over, the brain reflects them as strengthened pathways, neural habits to apply in times of duress, frustration, hurt. And while the everyday substance of emotional literacy classes may look mundane, the outcome, that's decent human beings, is more critical to our future than ever. Compare a moment from a class in self-science with the classroom experiences you can recall. A fifth-grade group is about to play the Cooperation Squares game, in which the students team up to put together a series of square-shaped jigsaw puzzles. The catch? Their teamwork is all in silence, with no gesturing allowed. The teacher, Joanne Vargo, divides the class into 3 groups, each assigned to a different table. 3 observers, each familiar with the game, get an evaluation sheet to assess, for example, who in the group takes the lead in organizing, who's a clown, who disrupts. The students dump the pieces of the puzzles on the table and go to work. Within a minute or so, it's clear that one group is surprisingly efficient as a team. They finish in just a few minutes. A second group of 4 is engaged in solitary parallel efforts, each working separately on their own puzzle, but getting nowhere. Then they slowly start to work collectively to assemble the first square and continue to work as a unit until all the puzzles are solved. But the third group still struggles, with only one puzzle nearing completion, and even that looking more like a trapezoid than a square. Sean, Fairley, and Raymond have yet to find the smooth coordination that the other 2 groups fell into. They're clearly frustrated, frantically scanning the pieces on the table, seizing on likely possibilities, and putting them near the partly finished squares, only to be disappointed by the lack of fit. The tension breaks a bit when Raymond takes 2 of the pieces and puts them in front of his eyes like a mask. His partners giggle. This will prove to be a pivotal moment in the day's lesson. Joanne Vargo, the teacher, offers some encouragement. Those of you who have finished can give one specific hint to those who are still working. Dagan moseys over to the still struggling group, points to 2 pieces that jut out from the square and suggests, "You've got to move those 2 pieces around." Suddenly Raymond, his wide face furrowed in concentration, grasps the new gestalt, and the pieces quickly fall into place on the first puzzle, then the others. There's spontaneous applause as the last piece falls into place on the third group's final puzzle. But as the class goes on to mull over the object lessons and teamwork they've received, there's another, more intense interchange. Raymond, tall and with the shock of bushy black hair cut into a longish crew cut, and Tucker, the group's observer, are locked in contentious discussion over the rule that you can't gesture. Tucker, his blond hair neatly combed except for a cowlick, wears a baggy blue T-shirt emblazoned with the motto, "Be responsible," which somehow underscores his official role. Tucker says, "You can't too offer a piece, that's not gesturing." Raymond insists vehement, "But that is gesturing." Vargo notices the heightened volume and increasingly aggressive staccato of the exchange and gravitates to their table. This is a critical incident, a spontaneous exchange of heated feeling. It's in moments such as this that the lessons already learned will pay off and new ones can be taught most profitably. And as every good teacher knows, the lessons applied in such electric moments will last in students' memories. Vargo coaches, "This isn't a criticism. You cooperated very well, but, Tucker, try to say what you mean in a tone of voice that doesn't sound so critical." Tucker, his voice calmer now, says to Raymond, "You can just put a piece where you think it goes. Give someone what you think they need without gesturing, just offering." Raymond responds in an angry tone. "You could have just gone like this." He scratches his head to illustrate an innocent movement, and he'd say no gesturing. There's clearly more to Raymond's ire than this dispute about what does or does not constitute a gesture. His eyes constantly go to the evaluation sheet Tucker has filled out. Though it has not yet been mentioned, the evaluation sheet has actually provoked the tension between Tucker and Raymond. On the evaluation sheet, Tucker has listed Raymond's name in the blank for "Who is disruptive?" Vargo, noticing Raymond looking at the offending form, hazards a guess, saying to Tucker, "He's feeling that you used a negative word, disruptive, about him. What did you mean?" "I didn't mean it was a bad kind of disruption," says Tucker, now conciliatory. Raymond isn't buying it, but his voice is calmer, too. "That's a little far-fetched, if you ask me." Vargo emphasizes a positive way of seeing it. Tucker's trying to say that what could be considered disruptive could also be part of lightening things up during a frustrating time. Raymond protests, now more matter-of-fact. "But disruptive is like when we're all concentrating hard on something, and if I went like this," he makes a ridiculous clowning expression, his eyes bulging, cheeks puffed out, "that would be disruptive." Vargo tries more emotional coaching, telling Tucker, "In trying to help, you didn't mean he was disruptive in a bad way, but you sent a different message in how you're talking about it. Raymond is needing you to hear and accept his feelings. Raymond is saying that having negative words like disruptive feels unfair. He doesn't like being called that." Then to Raymond she adds, "I appreciate the way you're feeling assertive and talking with Tucker. You're not attacking, but it's not pleasant to have a label like disruptive put on you. When you put those pieces up to your eyes, it seems like you were feeling frustrated and wanted to lighten things up. But Tucker called it disruptive because he didn't understand your intent. Is that right?" Both boys nod assent as the other students finish clearing away the puzzles. This small classroom melodrama is reaching its finale. "Do you feel better?" Vargo asks, "or is this still distressing?" "Yeah, I feel okay," says Raymond, his voice softer now that he feels heard and understood. Tucker nods too, smiling. The boys, noticing that everyone else has already left for the next class, turn in unison and dash out together. As a new group starts to find their chairs, Vargo dissects what has just transpired. The heated exchange and its cooling down draw on what the boys have been learning about conflict resolution. What typically escalates to conflict begins, as Vargo puts it, with not communicating, making assumptions, and jumping to conclusions, sending a hard message in ways that make it tough for people to hear what you're saying. Students in self-science learn that the point is not to avoid conflict completely, but to resolve disagreement and resentment before it spirals into a fight. There are signs of these earlier lessons in how Tucker and Raymond handled the dispute. Both, for example, made some effort to express their point of view in a way that would not accelerate the conflict. This assertiveness, as distinct from aggression or passivity, is taught at WIIFM from 3rd grade on. While at the beginning of the dispute neither boy was looking at the other, as it went on they began to show signs of active listening, facing each other, making eye contact, and sending the silent cues that let a speaker know he's being heard. For anyone familiar with the rough and tumble of 5th grade boys, what may be most remarkable is that both Tucker and Raymond tried to assert their views without resorting to blaming, name-calling, or yelling. Neither let their feelings escalate to a fistfight, nor cut off the other by stalking out of the room. At the traditional circle that opens each class in self-science, the numbers are not always so high as they were today. When they're low, the 1s, 2s, or 3s that indicate feeling terrible, it opens the way for someone to ask, "Do you want to talk about why you feel that way?" And if the student wants, no one is ever pressured to talk about things they don't want to. It allows the airing of whatever is so troubling and a chance to consider creative options for handling it. In use for close to 20 years, the self-science curriculum stands as a model for the teaching of emotional intelligence. The lessons sometimes are surprisingly sophisticated. As WIIFM's director, Karen Stone McCown, told me, "When we teach about anger, we help kids understand that it's almost always a secondary reaction and to look for what's underneath. Are you hurt or jealous? Our kids learn that you always have choices about how you respond to emotion, and the more ways you know to respond to an emotion, the richer your life can be." A list of the contents of self-science is an almost point-for-point match with the ingredients of emotional intelligence. The topics taught include self-awareness in the sense of recognizing feelings and building a vocabulary for them, and seeing the links between thoughts, feelings, and reactions, knowing if thoughts or feelings are ruling a decision, seeing the consequences of alternative choices, applying these insights to decisions about such issues as drugs, smoking, and sex. Self-awareness also takes the form of recognizing your strengths and weaknesses and seeing yourself in a positive but realistic light, and so avoiding a common pitfall of the self-esteem movement where too easy praise pumps up a false confidence. Another emphasis is managing emotions, realizing what's behind a feeling, for example, the hurt that triggers anger, and learning ways to handle anxieties, anger, and sadness. Still another emphasis is on taking responsibility for decisions and actions, and following through on commitments. A key social ability is empathy, understanding others' feelings and taking their perspective, and respecting differences in how people feel about things. Relationships are a major focus, including learning to be a good listener and question asker, distinguishing between what someone says or does and your own reactions and judgments, being assertive rather than angry or passive, and learning the arts of cooperation, conflict resolution, and negotiating compromise. There are no grades given in self-science. Life itself is the final exam. But at the end of the 8th grade, as students are about to leave WIIFM for high school, each is given a Socratic examination, an oral test in self-science. One question from a recent final: describe an appropriate response to help a friend solve a conflict over someone pressuring them to try drugs. Some programs in emotional and social skills take no curriculum or class time as a separate subject at all, but instead infiltrate their lessons into the very fabric of the school's life. One model for this approach, essentially an invisible emotional and social competence course, is the Child Development Project, created by a team directed by psychologist Eric Schaps. The project, based in Oakland, California, is currently being tried in a handful of schools across the nation, most in neighborhoods with a decaying core. The project offers a prepackaged set of materials that fit into existing courses. Thus, first graders in their reading class get a story, Frog and Toad Are Friends, in which Frog, eager to play with his hibernating friend Toad, plays a trick on him to get him up early. The story is used as a platform for class discussion about friendship and issues such as how people feel when someone plays a trick on them. A succession of adventures brings up topics such as self-consciousness, being aware of a friend's needs, what it feels like to be teased, and sharing feelings with friends. A set curriculum plan offers increasingly sophisticated stories as children go through the elementary and middle school grades, giving teachers entry points to discuss topics such as empathy, perspective-taking, and caring. As developmental psychologists and others map the growth of emotions, they're able to be more specific about just what lessons children should be learning at each point in the unfolding of emotional intelligence. By 4th and 5th grade, as peer relationships take on an immense importance in their lives, they get lessons that help their friendships work better: empathy, impulse control, and anger management. For impulse control, there's a stoplight poster displayed prominently with 3 steps. Red light. Stop, calm down, and think before you act. Yellow light. Say the problem and how you feel. Think of lots of solutions. Think ahead to the consequences. Green light. Go ahead and try the best plan. The stoplight notion is regularly invoked when a child, for example, is about to strike out in anger or withdraw into a huff at some slight or burst into tears at being teased, and it offers a concrete set of steps for dealing with these loaded moments in a more measured way. Beyond the management of feelings, it points a way to more effective action, and as a habitual way of handling the unruly emotional impulse. To think before acting from feelings, it can evolve into a basic strategy for dealing with the risks of adolescence and beyond. Some of the lessons relate more directly to the temptations and pressures for sex, drugs, or drinking that begin to enter children's lives. Some of the most effective programs in emotional literacy were developed as a response to a specific problem, notably violence. One of the fastest growing of these prevention-inspired emotional literacy courses is the Resolving Conflict Creatively program in several hundred New York City public schools and schools across the country. The conflict resolution course focuses on how to settle schoolyard arguments that can escalate into incidents like the hallway shooting of Ian Moore and Tyrone Sinkler by their classmate at Jefferson High School. One key to the success of the conflict resolution program is extending it beyond the classroom to the playground and cafeteria, where tempers are more likely to explode. To that end, some students are trained as mediators, a role that can begin in the latter years of elementary school. When tension erupts, students can seek out a mediator to help them settle it. The schoolyard mediators learn to handle fights, taunts, and threats, interracial incidents, and the other potentially incendiary incidents of school life. Beyond the mediation of a given dispute, the program teaches students to think differently about disagreements in the first place. As Angel Perez, trained as a mediator while in grade school, put it, the program changed my way of thinking. I used to think, hey, if somebody picks on me, if somebody does something to me, the only thing was to fight, do something to get back at them. Since I had this program, I've had a more positive way of thinking. If something's done negative to me, I don't try to do the negative thing back, I try to solve the problem. And he's found himself spreading the approach in his community. As family life no longer offers growing numbers of children a sure footing in life, schools are left as the one place communities can turn to for correctives to children's deficiencies in emotional and social competence. That's not to say that schools alone can stand in for all the social institutions that too often are in or nearing collapse. But since virtually every child goes to school, at least at the outset, it offers a place to reach children with basic lessons for living that they may never get otherwise. Emotional literacy implies an expanded mandate for schools, taking up the slack for failing families and socializing children. This daunting task requires two major changes: that teachers go beyond their traditional mission, and that people in the community become more involved with their schools. There's a self-selection in the kind of teacher who gravitates to courses such as these because not everyone is suited by temperament. To begin with, teachers need to be comfortable talking about feelings. Not every teacher is at ease doing so or wants to be. There's little or nothing in the standard education of teachers that prepares them for this kind of teaching. For these reasons, emotional literacy programs typically give prospective teachers several weeks of special training in the approach. Beyond teacher training, emotional literacy expands our vision of the task of schools themselves, making them more explicitly society's agent for seeing that children learn these essential lessons for life, a return to a classic role for education. This larger design requires, apart from any specifics of curriculum, using opportunities in and out of class to help students turn moments of personal crisis into lessons in emotional competence. It also works best when the lessons at school are coordinated with what goes on in children's homes. Many emotional literacy programs include special classes for parents to teach them about what their children are learning, not just to complement what's imparted at school, but to help parents who feel the need to deal more effectively with their children's emotional life. Another way in which this focus reshapes schools is in building a campus culture that makes it a caring community, a place where students feel respected, cared about, and bonded to classmates, teachers, and the school itself. In short, the optimal design of emotional literacy programs is to begin early, be age-appropriate, run throughout the school years, and intertwine efforts at school, at home, and in the community. Perhaps the most telling sign of the impact of such emotional literacy classes are the data at a school where the unbendable rule is that children caught fighting are suspended. As the emotional literacy classes have been phased in over the years, there's been a steady drop in the number of suspensions. Last year, says the school's principal, there were 106 suspensions. So far this year, and we're up to March, there have been only 26. There have been a handful of objective evaluations, the best of which compare students in these courses with equivalent students not taking them, with independent observers rating the children's behavior. Pooling such assessments reveals a widespread benefit for children's emotional and social competence, for their behavior in and out of the classroom, and for their ability to learn. First, there's more emotional self-awareness, improvement in recognizing and naming their own emotions, better able to understand the causes of feelings, recognizing the difference between feelings and actions. Second, They're better at managing emotions, better frustration tolerance and anger management, fewer verbal put-downs, fights, and classroom disruptions, better able to express anger appropriately without fighting, fewer suspensions and expulsions, and less aggressive generally. More positive feelings about self, school, and family, better at handling stress, less loneliness and social anxiety. They're better at harnessing emotions productively, more responsible, better able to focus on the task at hand and pay attention, less impulsive with more self-control. They improve in empathy and reading emotions, better able to take another's perspective, improve sensitivity to others' feelings, better at listening to others, and they handle relationships better, increased ability to understand relationships, better at resolving conflicts and negotiating disagreements, better at solving problems in relationships, more assertive and skilled at communicating, more popular and outgoing, friendly and involved with peers, more concerned and considerate, more harmonious in groups, more sharing, cooperative, and helpful, more democratic in dealing with others. One item on this list demands special attention. Emotional literacy programs improve children's academic achievement scores and school performance. This is not an isolated finding. It recurs again and again in such studies. In a time when too many children lack the capacity to handle their upsets, to listen or focus, to rein in impulse, to feel responsible for their work or care about learning, anything that will buttress these skills will help in their education. In this sense, emotional literacy enhances schools' ability to teach. Even in a time of back to basics and budget cuts, there's an argument to be made that these programs help reverse a tide of educational decline and strengthen schools in accomplishing their main mission, and so are well worth the investment. Beyond these educational advantages, the courses seem to help children better fulfill their roles in life, becoming better friends, students, sons and daughters, and in the future more likely to be better husbands and wives, workers and bosses, parents and citizens. While not every boy and girl will acquire these skills with equal sureness, to the degree they do, we're all the better for it. A rising tide lifts all boats, as Tim Shriver put it. It's not just the kids with problems, but all kids who can benefit from these skills. These are an inoculation for life. There's an old-fashioned word for the body of skills that emotional intelligence represents: character. Character, writes Amitai Etzioni, the George Washington University social theorist, is the psychological muscle that moral conduct requires. And philosopher John Dewey saw that a moral education is most potent when lessons are taught to children in the course of real events, not just as abstract lessons, the mode of emotional literacy. If character development is a foundation of democratic societies, consider some of the ways emotional intelligence buttresses this foundation. The bedrock of character is self-discipline. The virtuous life, as philosophers since Aristotle have observed, is based on self-control. A related keystone of character is being able to motivate and guide oneself, whether in doing homework, finishing a job, or getting up in the morning. And, as we have seen, the ability to defer gratification and to control and channel one's urges is a basic emotional skill, one that in a former day was called will. Being able to put aside one's self-centered focus and impulses has social benefits. It opens the way to empathy. Empathy leads to caring, altruism, and compassion. These capacities are ever more called on in our increasingly pluralistic society, allowing people to live together in mutual respect and creating the possibility of productive public discourse. Despite high interest in emotional literacy among some educators, these courses are as yet rare. Most teachers, principals, and parents simply do not know they exist. The best models are largely outside the education mainstream, in a handful of private schools and a few hundred public schools. Of course, no program, including this one, is an answer to every problem. But given the crises we find ourselves and our children facing, and given the quantum of hope held out by courses in emotional literacy, we must ask ourselves, shouldn't we be teaching these most essential skills for life to every child, now more than ever? And if not now, when?